Good afternoon. If you wouldn't mind making your way into the room with the glass and sitting toward the front. Thanks. Would be great if you can fill in closer to the front, although I understand you may not. We'll get started in just a moment. Not yet. At some point that will begin. As soon as probably you start talking. You will know. Oh, wonderful. I believe the camera is, I believe it's right up there, if I'm not mistaken. I think, yeah, because these are projectors. Yeah, hey Elizabeth? Elizabeth. Do you know which of these is the camera for the live stream? Which of these is the camera for the live stream? I'm not certain. Is that one back there? Okay. All right. There we go. All right. So I think we should go ahead and I'll ask them to take their Good afternoon. If you wouldn't mind taking your seats, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Okay, we're going to try to get started now if we could. I'm Eliot Gerson, Executive Vice President of the Institute. I'm delighted to see all of you here today. It's such a beautiful day. It's always hard to come from outside with all those great views to inside, but you're going to have a fabulous program. I am very privileged here at the Institute to have a number of responsibilities. I oversee our policy programs, of which the one you are now all affiliated with is one of, I think, 28. Ida, does that sound about right? And also our public programs, which are events that are, as they sound, open to the public, things like the Ideas Festival and other things we do around the world. And when I say around the world, my third hat is to coordinate the activities of our Aspen Institutes that exist in other countries. We are now in 11 other countries. And I think that's just, it's pertinent to mention because obviously the issue that brings all of us together here is really a global issue. It's not just an American issue. And I know this program has already had some very fruitful discussions with some of our partners in other countries. I'm just curious to ask, I know this is the fourth annual Aspen Leadership Forum on Retirement Savings. I expect that some of you have been involved since the first one, but let me just ask how many of you are new this time and have not been involved before? Very interesting. So about half of you. So I will take, if you don't mind, Karen and Ida, 30 seconds or so to welcome you to the broader Aspen and just tell you a little bit about Aspen. It's one of those places that most people, especially people as distinguished as you, might have heard of, but if you were probably asked, what does the Aspen Institute do, you'd have a very difficult time explaining that. Well, that's a challenge for many of us here as well, and I've been here 15 years. Although, in fact, there are things that unify all we do, but we've now become a very large institution with more than 500 employees, to say nothing of our international operations just domestically. And our range of interests is probably broader than any vaguely comparable institution, ranging across all aspects of domestic policy and foreign policy, but we're also an educational institution of sorts, and we do seminars. We're a leadership institution. We bring together networks of leaders and inspire them to go beyond what they're doing professionally to have even further engagement in making this a better society for everyone. But essentially, we were founded in 1949 in Aspen, Colorado, which is our summer home, and why we're called the Aspen Institute, by a business leader, CEO of a major American industrial company, who really wanted to inspire his fellow, and at that time they were almost all white males, I'm embarrassed to say, but his fellow leaders of American and increasingly global business to be not just better leaders of their businesses, but much more engaged citizens and contribute more to the general welfare. And so the goals were very humanistic. They were to create a more just and equitable society, and that still animates just about everything we do. And so it's entirely appropriate, quite natural, and we're very proud of the fact that the Financial Security Program is such an important anchor now of what we do. Retirement savings has been a focus of this program since its inception. And I mean, for obvious reasons, not just because American households deserve to be financially stable, and far too many are not, but also so that they could also accumulate some degree of wealth, so the benefits of their labor would be able to provide even greater security for not just themselves, but for their families. And also, and this is increasingly a theme, a central theme that cuts across the entire enterprise of the Aspen Institute, retirement savings are absolutely critical if we are going to build a more equitable and inclusive economy. And we actually recently did some work with our trustees and supporters, which are chiefly foundations, but also many individuals and, of course, companies. And repeatedly, two issues came up as the most important issues that they felt we should be addressing in as many of the activities we engage in as possible. One is climate change, and the other is a more equitable capitalism, a more equitable society, particularly ways in which people who labor very hard but aren't able to benefit as much as others can from their labor. And when you consider, of course, in retirement savings that roughly half of our fellow Americans do not benefit from and have not benefited from the enormous increase in the value of the stock market, because about 50% of the people don't have any kind of investments. It is a moral imperative, but it's also, we think, a political imperative, given the increasing division, divisiveness, and polarization in our society, as is evident anytime we watch the news. So in any case, we are really thrilled to have you here for the first public kickoff of the Leadership Forum on Retirement Savings. And another thing I'll just say about the Institute, and especially to those of you who raised your hands because you haven't been here before, we are also very much, as I mentioned, about leadership and about creating networks of leaders from different segments of society. We do that in many ways, from in our programs, even we do seminars for leaders. So you are very much part of that family, and we think of it as a family, a network of leaders networked for the common purposes you'll be discussing over this forum here and in Middleburg. But also you are networked in ways that I hope you'll discover with the other leadership networks that are across the Institute, many of which actually share your passion about equity and opportunity. So I hope you will soon discover that if you haven't already. So without any further delay, it is my great pleasure to introduce Karen Andres, who's the Director of Policy and Market Solutions and the Project Director of the Retirement Savings Initiative of the Financial Security Program, to officially kick off our agenda. I hope you have a terrific time, and I look forward to everything that you come up with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you will notice I did not shake Eliot's hand just then, because I think we should all be okay with not shaking hands. I just want to, if you want to wave, that's cool. If you want to do that, I've seen many elbow bumps. Hi, Jeff, right? If you do want to do that, that's fine. Let's all set a norm where that's okay. So seriously, it's nice to see all of you. As many of you know, at the Aspen Leadership Forum on Retirement Savings, we seek to convene diverse leaders like all of you to drive convergence on how to tear down the barriers that are keeping us from building the retirement savings system that Americans really need. And we are in our fourth year of this forum. We see this as a 10-year dialogue, and we're excited to say that we've seen the ways that this conversation is changing and has changed. And I'm really excited about this conversation today and what will come over the next few days to hear how the dialogue has continued to evolve. I want to acknowledge our sponsors, our supporters of this event, JP Morgan Asset Management, AARP, and Prudential Financial, without whose support this would not be possible. I just want to say a bit about sort of thematically what we'll be talking about today and over the next few days. So our goals here, we want to continue to push ourselves and all of you to think about how we can expand access to workplace retirement savings for the millions, 30 to 50, somewhere in that range of Americans who don't have access at work. We also want to continue to mash together worlds. We believe that the retirement savings ecosystem very much belongs in the same dialogue or conversation with the fields of financial stability and financial security. And then finally, we aim to continue to expand the field of leaders. We need to be thinking about what is the leadership that we need now, what is it the leadership that we need in the decades to come as our economy and as our nation changes. So many of you will be joining us for a private retreat over the next few days, and we're really happy to have you here with us. I want to thank you for making the time and the journey to get here in many cases, and I know that right now that's actually particularly important. There's a lot of uncertainty given what's going on with a global public health emergency. So please rest assured that the health and safety of all of you and of our staff have been our highest priority, and we have been actively monitoring government guidance on the recent outbreak of the coronavirus, as well as best practices of other convening organizations. And we've decided that this event still fits within the risk parameters that we're comfortable with. So we just doubly appreciate your presence here, and throughout the next couple of days, we'll be letting you know about any measures that we've taken or that we ask that you take, but mostly it boils down to wash your hands. I'm a mom. I can say that. So I also want to welcome those of you who are joining us via webcast. Isn't technology great? Some people who couldn't come because of travel policies can be with us via webcast, as well as other members of the public. So we're delighted to have all of you here with us as well. And just a few logistical notes before we welcome our first discussants to the stage. We'd appreciate it if you would silence your phones. And second, we want you to not silence yourselves. This is meant to be a dialogue. And so in each discussion, we'll be opening up questions and comments to the audience. So please raise your hand and we will bring you a mic so that our colleagues and friends on the webcast can hear as well. So I'm excited about what we have lined up this afternoon. And as you can see from your agenda that you either have in your hands or that you have online, we'll begin with an evidence-based discussion about the distribution of wealth and savings in the United States and how that aligns or does not align with the America that we want. Next, we'll pivot to a discussion about how we can build a durable movement that results in improvements to our system that really match the scale of the problem that we have. Then we'll take a break, and then we'll close out our afternoon with a discussion with private sector leaders. We're in a moment where we as a society are in a conversation about how to make capitalism work for everybody, and a lot of those corporations are leading that discussion. And so we want to reflect and get their perspective on what does that mean for the role and responsibility of the private sector vis-a-vis retirement savings. So, with that, I'll go ahead and invite our first set of discussants to the stage. So we're going to be joined first by Ray Bashara, who directs the Center for Household Financial Stability at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. We're also joined by Dorothy Brown, who is a professor of law at Emory University and an expert on the legal structures that have led to and continue to perpetuate the racial wealth gap in the United States. And then finally, we have Jeff Brown, who is the dean of the Gies School of Business at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, but he's many other things too. And I'm sure he will draw upon all of those experiences. And we're lucky to have Joanna Smith-Romani, who's the managing director of the Financial Security Program, serve as our moderator. So I'll hand it over to Joe.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you for also doing the introductions. Now I don't need to. And I believe we all have bios. So if you do not know all the other things that Karen mentioned that Jeff can do, you can then find them in your attachment, and perhaps you'll mention some of those hobbies to all of us. But in all honesty, what a luxury, frankly, and privilege to be the first panel. We have two things we have to do, which are sort of big challenges for us, but I feel like this is the right panel to do that. I think you guys will agree with me once we get into it, but it's to, one, as Karen mentioned, make sure we are grounded in what is really happening in this country around assets, around financial security, around gender, around race, around all these differences. We need to know that to design a better system. And then importantly, not use that as the only basis for our imagination and creativity of the world we want to see. What are our values? How are they reflected or not in the system we have? How are they reflected or not in the systems that are being proposed? And what is our role as leaders, as Eliot so eloquently said at the beginning? You guys are being here, are part of an Aspen Leaders movement. And we all leave here with a piece of this that's ours to own and to do something about. So I'm excited to do this panel in part because I am not a retirement expert. So to do any of the subsequent panels would show obvious holes in my expertise. I am a short-term stability kind of person. But I do love talking about values, and I like talking about the real lived experience of Americans because I think we all need to understand that deeply to do our work better. So I'm excited. I'm going to kick this off with Ray. There's no one who understands what's happening in this country better, I think, than Ray. So Ray, and now you have a big role to fill. But tell me first some of the facts, the important ones, like the ones we have to know going into the next 3 days for the distribution. What is happening with the distribution of wealth and assets? What do we currently look like? Is this bananas that we are the way we are now, or does history tell us anything? But like, get us all focused on the key things we need to know and understand.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all, and it's great to be here. I also have the great fortune of being a senior fellow in the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. So first of all, I have to say, of course, these are my own views, not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve. I'm glad I remembered to say that. So I think what I'll do is start off by giving you 3 less surprising facts about inequality, things that you might have heard before, wealth inequality, and then maybe 3 more surprising facts.
Super.
All right? So first, on the non-surprising, wealth inequality dwarfs income inequality, and many people believe that it's actually more consequential. It matters more that you don't have wealth. It matters for resilience, for opportunity, for intergenerational transfers. So that's the first thing. Second, not surprising, it's growing, and it's grown substantially in the last 30 years. The wealth at the top, as many others have documented, not just the Fed, has really become more concentrated at the top. But it's actually gotten much worse for the folks who we mostly care about in this room. The bottom half of the population in 1989 had 3% of the nation's wealth. They now have just 1%. All right? And the third less surprising fact is that the gains have overwhelmingly accrued to older families, college-educated families, and whites. All right? Overwhelmingly, that's where the wealth has gone to over the last 30 years, okay? Now let me shift to 3 perhaps more surprising facts about wealth inequality. First is that, we often think about college as the great equalizer. In fact, college, a 4-year degree and above, has in fact become an engine of inequality itself, right? So if you look at the returns, wealth returns on a college degree, and those that are higher, they've skyrocketed over the last 30 years, whereas the returns for those who have less than that have basically decreased or flatlined. So the gap is actually getting larger than it used to. And college serving as an engine of inequality is particularly true when you're talking about the racial wealth gap, all right? Second surprising fact, the racial wealth gap, by that I mean the black-white wealth gap, has actually not changed much in the last 30 years. There's a lot of measurement issues here. Some people say it's getting worse. Our data show that in fact it hasn't gotten better or worse. It's stayed the same. Roughly, blacks have roughly 10% of the wealth of whites. What makes this surprising is that over that very 30-year period, we've had all kinds of other gains: income, wages, employment, education, civil rights, voting rights, political representation. Somehow, those commendable gains are not translating into more wealth, all right? And when we did a little bit of research on that, it turns out that roughly 80% of that 10-to-1 wealth gap is fixed or residual or cumulative, of 400 years of deliberate public policies to deny African Americans the ability to accumulate wealth, whereas 20% of it is really behavioral. So even if you do all the right things, control for income and education, family structure, and age, you still can really only affect about 20% of that gap, all right? And then the final surprising fact is the extent to which the year of your birth really predicts your level of wealth. Now, and if you look at younger Americans, those, millennials, for example, it turns out that if you were born in the 1960s, which is not a millennial, but if you were born in the 1960s, you were likely to have 18% less wealth than your parents did at a similar age. If you were born in the 1970s, 23% less. And if you were born in the 1980s, you're projected to have 36% less wealth than your parents did at a similar age. So older Americans today are much wealthier than they were a generation ago. Younger Americans are doing worse. So it used to be that the gap between the generations was growing, but for very good reasons, because kids were doing better than their parents. But starting in about the 70s, that flipped. So now the gap is still growing between the generations, but because younger generations are doing progressively worse. And it turns out if you isolate everything you can, it's the moment that you're born, the luck of your birth year, that really has a profound effect on your ability to accumulate wealth. What was the labor market like when you entered it? Did you have to borrow for your higher education? Was it a gig economy? Was the safety net strong? These are the kinds of things that really matter. So, and I think this is actually a threat to the social contract, which we can talk about a little bit later. So those are just a few baseline facts.
Yeah, it's just a few baseline facts.
Yeah.
Some really important framing, and I think those more just like provocative, like, did you really know that? I'm so glad you threw in. Really, the last one, especially when we get to the values conversation, right? What is the promise of this country? What do we believe the promise of this country is? How is our policy and market set up for something that is actually happening opposite than what we think should be happening? Ray, just really briefly, and then I want to move over to Dorothy. Can you just say a little more like precisely, just so we're all like putting the finest point on it going into the next couple of days, what you just said, how does that interact with retirement? And what do you think matters between those 6 statements of what's happening in this country and retirement?
Okay, so 4 very quick points here. First is it really is a reflection. What's retirement savings is really a reflection of these overall wealth trends. So just as younger, less educated, non-white, and low-income families have seen their wealth either flatline or decline, you're seeing the same thing with retirement savings levels. In fact, second, if you look at the median wealth level of low-income, less educated, non-white, and younger families, it ranges from about 16 to 24,000. Okay, that's really low. That's really low, and retirement savings is just a small part of those already very low numbers. As a matter of fact, 88% of retirement wealth is held by whites, and 74% of retirement wealth is held by college grads. So it's very concentrated among whites and among college grads. Third point, and this is a little bit encouraging, the retirement wealth gap is actually narrower than the overall wealth gap when you factor in the value of defined benefit pensions. Okay, that actually is serving as a little bit of an equalizing force on the retirement wealth gap. So that's something I hope we can talk more about.
Yep.
And then finally, many of you have seen the Roland Fryer and other research about how small racial disparities get magnified over time. We found this to be true in retirement balances as well. So for example, a white high school dropout has far more saved for retirement than a black with a graduate or a professional degree. The white high school dropout has about $49,000 in retirement savings. The black with the graduate or professional degree has about 30. So, these disparities are very real and actually end up getting magnified over time, not reduced.
Thank you. So, Dorothy, this is a great transition to you. Ray's talking about the data and the evidence and what do we understand. For us to build not a massively different, but we have some good things to work on, but the future of the retirement system, what do we have to think about in terms of the legacy of the legal systems that have brought us here to date? And I know that's been quite a bit of work you've been doing.
So I've written about the tax implications, or the race implications of tax policy. When we talk about retirement, we talk about the tax benefits for employer-provided pensions, employer-provided retirement accounts, and health benefits. And what you see, or what my research shows, is it's more likely for white employees to get jobs that come with those benefits. So when we think about the legacy of discriminatory laws, and we now have the Civil Rights Act, and all of that's over, and we have the law that basically requires intent in order to find discrimination. So I want to get back to something Ray said about 20% people could control themselves. You can go to college, you can get a good job, blah, 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 blah. But there's research that shows if you're a black college graduate from Harvard, you have to send out more resumes than if you are a white college graduate from Harvard. There is nothing that black college graduate from Harvard can do to fix that, right? So the law doesn't help him in this instance because the law would, well, it's even worse than that. So not only do you have to send out more resumes if you're a black Harvard grad, you get responses for interviews for lower paying jobs. So occupational segregation is very much raised, and what we see is even when black workers do everything right, they're far less likely to be able to get a job that comes with these tax-free benefits that would enable us to build wealth and do all those kind of wonderful things. And the law doesn't help us here because the law doesn't look at the fact that there's a discriminatory effect. It requires intent. It requires an employer to basically say, oh, I did that because you were black. And, you know, we actually read about those stories in the newspaper, but they're few and far between. So the law doesn't really help us. And in terms of, you know, the legacy, a lot of people, I mean, we can talk about homeownership just as an example, right? Because not everybody, but most people know FHA insured loans. If you were black, 2% of the loans, FHA insured loans, went to blacks because they were redlined. So we now have a Fair Housing Act of '68, except the market problem is still there. White homeowners don't want to live in neighborhoods with lots of black folks. And there are lots of reasons white homeowners give for not doing that. But we know that there's a different valuation on homes in white neighborhoods. So the law has been changed to say we don't discriminate anymore, but white homeowners are in effect discriminating in terms of where they want to buy. So the law that got us into this, the law that allowed the government to discriminate against Black Americans cannot be used in 2020, maybe 2021, cannot be used in 2020 to remedy it because the law now says we're going to be colorblind. We're going to not take it. It's not right. The way you get past discriminating on the basis of race is to not discriminate on the basis of race. I'm quoting Chief Justice Roberts, right? Yeah, right. So we can't look at the law to fix this problem because, well, until we get different people on the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court precedent says you can't do it. So we have lots of areas where there's this discriminatory effect of policies that were set in motion decades or centuries ago. But right now, the law is not our friend. The law is not an ally to how we can move forward. I think if we're going to move forward, we are going to have to roll up our sleeves and decide we're going to do it in spite of the fact that the law won't make us do it.
Fascinating. So that's a really important kind of thing deep in our mind, not even deep, front in our minds that you brought front. And we're thinking about what are we going to do over the next couple of days to really roll up our sleeves and wrestle with some of these issues. What you also made me think about, though, is not just the law in the case of retirement, but the intersection between laws that created other wealth and other access and how that interacts also with retirement and financial security, if I'm following
Yes.
you where I think you're trying to go.
Yes.
Or where you have gone in your research, I should say.
Yes.
So poor Jeff, he's got to do the last of our doomsday report before we get very aspirational about the values and systems of where we want to go, which is where we're going to spend a lot of the next days together. Jeff, we have all these lenses that Ray shared and Dorothy shared. What we haven't talked too much about is some of the intergenerational issues, some with the where you're born, the year you were born matters. I was almost going to be like, after this, we'll talk about the year I was born. But then you gave my decade, which I don't need to share. But can you talk more about some of the intergenerational issues and Social Security and some of these distributions of assets and wealth and how that plays into where we're going with this conversation about understanding the system as it exists today?
Absolutely. And first, let me just thank the Aspen Institute. I think it's really great to have organizations like this that bring folks together for thoughtful conversations. I think there's too little of that these days. As if we didn't already have enough complexity to deal with based on what the prior panelists spoke to, the whole intergenerational aspect I think is enormously important. And let me actually use Ray's point as a jumping off point, which is if you think about when I used to teach classes on social insurance, I used to talk about, why do we want the government to be involved in anything? What are some things that the government can do that the private sector cannot do? And one of the leading things on that list is the ability to do sort of intergenerational risk sharing, right? To be able to recognize that depending on when you were born, something that you had no control over, I suppose your parents did, but you certainly did not. Certain generations are going to be hit by negative shocks and others are going to be hit by positive shocks. If you're the generation that was entering the job market in 2008, you're probably going to have a different lifetime income trajectory than someone who entered into the job market during a boom time, for example. I can give you lots of those examples. And one of the things that a well-designed government program can do is kind of try to help smooth across some of those shocks. In essence, that's partly what Social Security was designed to do. It was obviously brought about in the depths of the Great Depression. The Social Security Act of 1935, it was originally intended as a funded program where you actually had savings. They referred to them as annuities, but you would buy an individual annuity contract essentially. And then a few years later, before it was rolled out, it turned into this pay-as-you-go system, which made perfect sense at the time because this was a generation that was on the verge of retirement during the Great Depression. And a lot of them, I think honestly, I don't know what they would have done had they reached retirement age after a decade of the Great Depression with nothing to rely on. And so you have these stories, you've all heard the story of Ida Mae Fuller, who was the first recipient, and I looked it up the other day. She paid about $24 and almost $25 in payroll taxes into Social Security. And by the time she died, she had received over $22,000 in payments. Now, that was a great deal for her. And it was a great deal for her generation, and it was a great deal for most of the generations up until now. And one of the interesting things is that intergenerational risk sharing really didn't distinguish between which of those birth years did well and which ones didn't. Instead, what it's been doing, it's been an enormously generous program for early cohorts, and it has gotten sort of increasingly less generous each generation forward. And that's going to continue to be the case because now we're about 15 years away from having to make hopefully we make the decisions earlier than 15 years from now, but in about 15 years is when the Social Security trust funds will run dry and we'll have no choice but to take some sort of legislative action. So this is a very long-winded way of saying that we've made some fairly significant transfers from working generations to the prior generation. Certainly there have been times when that's made a lot of sense. It may or may not make sense in all eras, but we're kind of like, we have to live with that. Because given the structure of the program, we've made promises. I don't really hear anyone suggesting that we really want to default on those promises. We might want to look differently at the program for future generations or current workers or what have you. But I think most people agree we should leave benefits alone for those that are in retirement or near it. But that means that we've got to deal with what is essentially a debt overhang of this program as we think about issues of distribution within generations. And that makes it more difficult because essentially there are fewer resources for us to spread around. I would also note that what is difficult about this particular time in history, and I mean the last decade, is that we're in a very unusual macroeconomic environment where interest rates are at it's certainly been the longest period of low interest rates that we've had in recent memory, maybe ever. I probably should have looked back all the way to 1776 and see if we've ever had one lower. And what this means is that the wealth accumulation piece is even more important because the same amount of wealth, if we'd had the same amount of wealth as our parents' generation, for example, that wouldn't provide you the same amount of retirement income in retirement as it would have for the parents' generation because returns are so low. And so that presents an additional challenge. And by the way, it's a challenge that isn't necessarily overcome simply by making it, running it through a government program rather than a private sector program. The point is that economy-wide returns are down, and that's something we're going to have to wrestle with as well. So, I'll stop there, but there's some really interesting interactions between the within cohort and across cohort pieces of all this. I was just in Clarksdale, Mississippi last week, which back 150 years ago had one of the highest per capita counts of millionaires in the country because they were all plantation owners who made enormous sums of money off the cotton trade. Today, it is one of the poorest counties in the United States, 83% African-American population. We were there working with an after-school program, and it's easy to see in those kids' faces. There's some kids, you could tell they're smart, they want to do well, but you just look around and you see how horrible the school system is, you see the lack of opportunity, you see the challenges, financial and otherwise, that their family faces. It's pretty clear that the idea that we have this sort of an American ideal of mobility isn't the same for everyone, and that's an important piece of this as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm about to shift us to the values part of it. Eliot, again, set the stage for me, so I don't have to do that, about how our organization is founded in and really still leads with values-based conversations and asking of our leaders the same thing. What is the world you want to see, and how are you part of the building of it, and what's your role there? So these guys, I'm so interested in hearing their perspective on the system we have and how to get to the system that's at least in their mind. And I want to then engage you guys in that conversation as well to hear about what are the kinds of values you'd like to see in a future retirement system here. But I'm going to ask you guys one apocalyptic question because we are where we are on March, whatever the date is, 2021. Do any of you want to respond to the question, what will happen if we do nothing? Or is it so obvious to you that nothing more needs to be said? And then we'll get to values.
We raised a lot of issues here. So
Yeah.
if we do nothing about which, any of them?
Yeah.
Any one of them, nothing about really
Nothing about nothing.
thinking about, let's just say thinking about the real financial, let's take raise stuff, about this issue about depending on your deck, everything is all up to sort of the luck of your year and really the luck of your zip code combined, right? Those things together. That too. We didn't get into that, but that's also true. And thinking about our future financial security and really how that interacts with our retirement. So let's just say we dealt with none of this stuff. We didn't deal with the fact that we
I'm
have
happy to take a shot.
a debt overhang of our program. And
I think we're already seeing it in the politics.
So you think
of the
we're here
day.
already?
I think on the right, the election of Trump was a reaction in part to a very large segment of the population believing that the system had failed them and they were just looking for anything that was something different. And I think we're seeing it in the Bernie Sanders campaign on the left this year, which it's interesting. I think there's a sense in which these two groups on certain issues kind of come together and have more in common than they do apart. I think it's a sense of a lot of people feeling like the system has failed them, that the system is stacked against them. And so I'm an economist, I'm a neoclassical economist. I believe strongly in markets and I get nervous when government wants to overreach, but I very much believe that if capitalism does not work for everyone, it won't be able to persist. And I think, I'm not saying that we're going to have a revolution, but I do think that we will have increasingly large segments of the population who are of that mindset and want to just tear down what we have, not even knowing what's to follow.
So I would say capitalism has never worked for everybody, right? Capitalism was built off the backs of enslaved people, right? So the notion that capitalism, if it doesn't work for everybody, we're going to have we had a civil war, okay, right? What would it take for another civil war? I don't know that doing nothing inexorably leads to something different. I think the fundamentals of capitalism, certain amount of unemployment, right, for capitalism to work, which means some people aren't going to get jobs. So I'm more cynical. I would like to think that if we don't fix it, somebody will fix it for us, but I'm really not convinced.
Well, I know we want to give Ray an opportunity to speak here.
Okay, I like that.
I didn't get that either, and that's why.
All right,
Thank you, Siri.
Poor Romy.
I have yet to see an example anywhere in the world where a economy has been able to grow. And let me put it this way. I think market forces in capitalism are responsible for the largest reductions in global poverty they're mind-boggling. If you look at these statistics about the number of people around the world that live on less than $1 a day or less than $2 a day, it is economic growth that has done more to eliminate poverty than anything else this world has ever seen.
Okay, but that wasn't responsive, right?
And capitalism is largely responsible for that economic growth. It is not always pretty, and I don't think we want it to be completely unfettered, right? I mean, I certainly agree that there need to be bounds on it. But I think this idea that there is some socialist utopia out there where we can desert market forces and think that we're going to have the resources to distribute, I think is naive, and I think there's not an example of it anywhere in the world that we can point to as successful over time.
So I want to respond.
Okay, well, I'm
I know he's going to get in, but since he
but
responded, I'm going to respond.
Okay, Dorothy, I'm giving you 30 seconds.
I didn't talk about socialism. What I said was capitalism has never worked for everyone, and I just want to point out he didn't respond. Saying that socialism, whatever.
But I'm also happy to.
Well, I
give
think
Ray,
so.
But
my
if you
point
want to
was
Jeff and
argue
Dorothy.
against capitalism,
Oh my
you have to
gosh.
suggest an
I
alternative.
didn't
We need
argue
Surrey
against
again. Surrey again.
capitalism.
No, that's
what
right.
I said was capitalism has never been inclusive
That's
for
right.
everyone.
And
That's
I
like
don't
a
think
fact.
that Jeff was disagreeing. And
I'm
the
not
reason
disagreeing
I'm
with that
interrupting
fact.
is not because I don't think this is
'cause Ray has to
super
talk.
important. Well, Ray
No,
can talk.
I think
but
Ray has to talk.
It's actually more because I think the thing behind it is the values. It's the conversation we want to get to. What do we want out of this system? What are we as leaders willing to stand up for in this system? And how do we use the policy and practices within our companies to reinforce that system? So this is not to say I could ever possibly settle a debate between two people as like scholarly and smart as you, but just to say I think part of this is not, it is the system and how do we use it and who has the power and control in it and the values behind that. But let me let Ray in because Dorothy's giving me side eye and then we'll keep it moving. And I encourage everyone to be at the bar tonight, where I won't be for another round of this, because this is important
Start a
stuff.
program on inclusive growth. We can talk about these things.
Yeah.
That started already. So just a historical point to build on something important that Jeff said, which was when they put the social contract in place, Social Security and other programs, it was premised on the idea that you would have rising wealth across generations. Right, so if each generation was going to be wealthier, no problem for them to support the previous generation, older Americans. Well, you know, if you have, in fact, rising wealth among older Americans, but declining or wealth among younger generations, it's really a threat to the social contract, right? And so a very serious one. I do worry that if we do nothing, it's not just retirement security that's really on the line. It's really the social contract itself, you know, that is really being called into question here. Yeah. And so, just to segue to the sort of the values question, I think we have to think differently about the social contract, about the values that underlie it, about inclusion, about equity. And we might have to think, you know, potentially about older generations supporting younger generations in ways that we haven't done historically.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for helping me with that transition. I'm going to give Dorothy the first word in this next question, though, since I stole her last word last round. So this is the part we want to get to, right? We can be in whatever kind of system, but we actually have to deeply think about what is it we care about and what is the good we're trying to build, hopefully the good. I have a list of values that seem like American values that we talk about. And what I want to have a discussion about is, what am I missing on my list? I know I'm missing things. That's on purpose. I just want everyone to know that. It's not that I don't think those matter. Karen made my list, so I'd have some missing. But also, what are we missing that are important to you and to you and this crowd? And what do we do with these to build a different system? What do they mean in terms of the system we have today and whether or not those are present or not? So freedom, working hard and being rewarded for that work, having lots of choices, fair competition, the ability to climb ladders to improve yourself and to make life better for your children, and personal responsibility. So those are some of the key ones that probably resonate as things that, whether you agree or disagree with them, things that sound like American values. What would you add, Dorothy, to that list of things that should be there and also do sound like either don't but should be American values or sound like American values?
Anti-discrimination.
Anti-discrimination.
And I want to pick up on something Ray said about the social contract and Social Security. Well, I think 2/3 of blacks were excluded from Social Security when we first got it. So I don't know that the social contract in America has ever been really inclusive. That gets back to my point about capitalism, right? So if we want to talk about a social contract, I think we need to recognize how history has excluded people of color. So if we're going to have another social contract, without being conscious of it, we're going to expect to exclude the same people because that's how we roll in America. So I would put anti-discrimination on the list.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate your comment on the important historical nuances.
And if I can pick up on that, to me, the value that's fundamental is inclusion, in fact. And there's a lot of different ways to think about that. Certainly, the fact that African Americans were excluded from every single public policy we had, starting with them being property, to the Homestead Act, to the GI Bill, to redlining, to Social Security. You know, it explains that persistent part of the wealth gap that I talked about earlier. But, you know, inclusion is also about a whole range of social policies that right now exclude a lot of people. Think about the retirement savings system, right? It assumes you, A, have an account, B, that you have savings, and C, if you want some sort of an incentive, you have a tax benefit, right? So you have to have a tax liability. Well, right there, a lot of people are excluded from the retirement savings system, not having those three things, right?
Yep.
You can think about 529 college savings accounts. Most people are excluded from that. The more we do social policy through individual tax-benefited savings accounts, the greater potential there is for exclusion. So what I would like to see is more policies, what I call sort of an inclusion by design or inclusion by default. Take this defaults regime idea that we have working so well with auto-enrollment, apply it to 529 college savings accounts at birth, which about 7 or 8 states are doing right now. An idea that I love and been working on for 20 years is a Roth IRA at birth for all kids and funded. Healthcare, Social Security. I was surprised to learn from Jeff how many people don't necessarily even participate in Social Security today. So if there was any value I would urge us to coalesce around is inclusion. Let's include everybody in some kind of a social policy system, ideally starting as early as birth. This is not a pipe dream. Singapore has done this very successfully for many years. I think there's a lot we can learn from. And so I would hope that inclusion really means inclusion and really means everybody.
Jeff, what about you to add in, and like Ray just did, any reactions to the list and current systems? I'm curious what you think about Social Security. I feel like there's some inherent pieces of the values I said and the design of it that don't match very well.
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with any of the values you said or the others that might come up. I think what's tricky is anytime we have a set of values or principles, there are going to be times that they come into conflict with each other. And then the question is, how do you prioritize them? So yeah, on the one hand, we all think that people should be rewarded for their work and have the opportunity for mobility and so forth. But we also think that that there's some, I think it's an American value that there ought to be some basic dignity, economic dignity that people ought to be provided. And those things can come into tension. So if you think about freedom versus redistribution, for example, there are some instances where those things are complementary, right? It's hard to really argue that somebody has real freedom if they have no economic resources. But on the other hand, they can come into conflict when the way we do redistribution is that we take money from person A in order to give it to person B. So it's less to me about completing the list than it is about how do we have difficult conversations around the different weights that we put on these values. And we see this in our politics, we see this in our policy debates. And that's always the core of where I think, at least if you go back 5 years ago when we were still having policy discussions, my sense is that at its core, it's not that people don't agree with the values, they just put different weights on them. And that leads to different policy outcomes. So if we take Social Security, for example, Social Security is interesting because it does actually a pretty admirable job of doing some redistribution in the sense of providing
that
people.
it's left out a whole host of people.
Although today it's nearly universal, and the only people that are not in it today, if you are working, if you've had 10 years of coverage, if you've had less than 10, you might not be covered unless you're a spouse or something like that, or members of the clergy and some state and local employees that have to be covered by a state plan. So it has taken a long time, but it is nearly universal today. But it's interesting because it provides income only if you make it to retirement. I'm setting aside disability for a moment. That is not a wealth accumulation device, right? And if anything, part of what undoes some of the redistribution in Social Security is that we have these huge racial and income-based mortality gaps. So I remember doing some research 20 years ago that showed that at the time, an African-American male with less than a high school education, that only 3 out of 5 of them were going to make it from age 22 to age 65, and therefore even be able to benefit from the Social Security system. Again, just the retirement piece of it. So, there have been debates in our past about the role of wealth accumulation through a Social Security or through some kind of a government saving system, and that's one of the tensions that's at play here. I think we blew an opportunity 20 years ago in 2001 where the two parties were just completely talking past each other on Social Security reform, and I do think that there's some middle ground there that could have moved us forward.
So I'm going to open it up to the crowd. I don't know if my mic is on. To the crowd, other thoughts on this? Like values you'd like to see in it, ways we don't see it right now, tensions, this question of how do you, I like that idea that they can all exist, but they can't all exist at the same level of priority, but who gets to decide what the priority is, I think is part of it. And because we're all learning who each other are, it would be super to say your names, since some of you we may be spending 3 days with.
Sure, of course. Hi, everybody. My name is Abigail Zapote. I'm the Executive Director of Latinos for a Secure Retirement. My question, one, I love the fact that you guys talked about the threat to the social contract because one, there are 11 million undocumented people who put in about $12 billion into the Social Security system every single year. I myself was undocumented for 15 years. I thankfully had the opportunity to become a citizen last year. But that is a part of the community that continues to be excluded from a system that they continuously put money into. Another part of my comment is that for the generations of people in this country that unfortunately every year, or depending on whatever year they were born, they accumulate less wealth. For Latinos who are able to become citizens, if they are second or third generation, they are able to accumulate more wealth than their parents did. And so I think that is also part of the conversation that we should be having, is talking to this community that continuously increases their wealth because of the access to education, because of access to wealth building tools that their parents never had access to. So I would just love to hear y'all's thoughts.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the first part's really, I think that both questions are important and interesting, and the first part gets at some of the value stuff we spoke about. I don't know if any one of you would like to react to that, maybe just one person so we can get to some other comments.
So what that reminded me of is the research on who benefits from employer-provided retirement accounts, and the group with the lowest percentage are Latinos, that about a quarter of Latinos who work for employers actually participate, and it's the lowest number. So it is a problem that has been there for years, and I would imagine it's only going to get worse. So we've been talking about white and black, but one of the things that I've seen in my research that scares me to no end is the low percentage of Latinos who are working for employers but not able to participate.
Thanks.
Can I say one thing really
Please,
quick?
of course, please, Jeff.
I just want to thank you for raising this issue, because unfortunately the perception, which is incorrect among a lot of voters, is that immigrants and undocumented immigrants are somehow coming into the U.S. and like taking advantage of the system and becoming net beneficiaries, when in actuality, what is happening in Social Security is many of them are paying in, but then they're not able to draw the benefits. So, the positive side of that is that it actually helps the solvency or the financial sustainability of the Social Security system, quite contrary to the common misperception that they're somehow a drain on the system. That's not fair to them individually. But I think those two, I think it's important to reconcile those two perspectives with facts as you did. So
Yeah,
thank you.
Jeff. Other comments, questions to add into the mix? Okay, well, I will ask my rapid fire one, and then we will be off the stage for other folks to join the conversation. So very rapid fire. Everyone think in their heads the fastest they can say this in a way that is not superficial and that has substance. So as Eliot, I'm challenging us all. As Eliot reminded us, Aspen is about building a free, just, and equitable society, right? That's why we started this whole conversation in both evidence and in values and in feelings. Like, what do we think we need to do about this? What are we called to action around as leaders and as servant leaders? And that's a very specific set of values for us, right? Just, free, equitable. Do you have ideas? Can you inspire us as we leave the stage for what a retirement system would look like? Again, don't be superficial, be really substantive. I'm giving you 30 seconds. In a free, just, and equitable society. Like, or there's some key design element you want to put out, not like a full policy proposal, Ray, because I know you have some. But what would be some key, I hope we all have ideas, both for the private sector and for the public sector. But what would be some key elements of that for a real retirement system in a free, just, equitable society, the one we all dream of building and that we're here to work on every day? Who wants to start? I won't make someone start first. Who's ready?
I'll go.
Okay.
So fully reformed, funded, robust Social Security system combined with a retirement savings account at birth for all kids.
What he said.
Agreement on stage. No other elements you'd want to make sure
What
we
he
had?
said.
Okay.
I could go for that, but let me, we're one of the few countries in the developed world that doesn't actually have a true minimum benefit in Social Security, and I think your plan would probably do that, but I mean, some minimum level of income, SSI kind of plays that role, but it's imperfect. So that's one thing I think we need. And then along the lines of what Ray said, I think the missed opportunity I think we had in 2001 is we had a Social Security system that was promising benefits up here, and we had this level of tax revenue. And the Republicans wanted to lower the benefits to what could be paid and then carve out accounts underneath. The Democrats wanted to leave the system alone and then add accounts on top. And I felt like there was room in the middle where we could have brought Social Security to a sustainable level and then had added on, mandatory funded accounts on top of that or something like that.
Yeah.
And in a sense, we're maybe kind of moving there with some of the state plans that David and others have worked on. Although I think that would be much better done at a federal level. So some kind of a true, as Ray said, a funded savings program on top of at least a minimum benefit level, I think are two features we really need.
Cool.
Can I add a third element?
Oh my gosh, of course.
So those two things,
Why not?
but we got to do something about liquidity for families. I mean, so basic financial stability is a prerequisite for financial security and retirement.
Yeah.
So we got to solve that problem too.
That's right. We can't solve that
Right.
long-term financial security
Right,
problems without thinking
exactly.
about what's happening. And that's what our program at FSP really thinks deeply about. So I'm going to let us go because I'm just so grateful for the generosity of this panel. I just want to thank you guys for the kind of conversation that I hope we'll have in the next couple of days, which is honest. We disagree, but are respectful. We're being creative. We're using our values, and we're being hopeful. Like, this is a world we actually can transform. So thank you all for coming here. Jeff actually has to go back today because they do this. Tell them really quickly and then we'll get off stage. This is the coolest thing
it's
ever. I
fun.
almost cried.
You know how the athletes have their signing day where they choose what school they're going to? Well, we have a signing day when our students declare their majors.
What?
And we live stream it so their parents can watch.
cool
Anyway,
is
I have to be
that?
back for that tomorrow.
Yeah,
So
right?
apologies.
That's so cool to celebrate academics
to
as
come
much
back
as we
to school
celebrate
now.
sports. And yeah, so Jeff has to leave us, but so you can't follow up with him too much after, though. I'm sure he's reachable. But the rest of us will be around. And thank you all. And thank you guys so much. We'll move on to the next panel.
Thank you.
So I'll just echo my thanks to Dorothy, Jeffrey, and Joe for setting the stage. And we touched on all the things that we're also going to dive deeper into for those of us who are going to be together over the next few days. So that was fabulous. Our next discussion is actually a very logical extension. They left off at just the perfect point. So we're going to consider what might come next in terms of federal policy solutions to the many problems that that we just laid out. So I want to note a last-minute substitution on our agenda. We had confirmed David Brown, who's the economic policy advisor to U.S. Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. David, unfortunately, was unable to join us because he has a cold, and under the circumstances, his boss thought it best that we not be coughing in public. So we thanked Senator Coons and David for their consideration of public health. We would expect no less. And in fact, we are delighted that Michael Krebs, who is a member of our advisory board, will be joining us on stage to share his perspective on kind of what comes next from a federal policy perspective. Both Ida Rademacher and Michael Krebs are going to be joined by Will Sandbrook, Executive Director of Nest Insight, from the United Kingdom, and the Honorable Nick Sherry, former Senator for the state of Tasmania from the Commonwealth of Australia. And we've asked Will and Nick to come share their experiences building movements for big action and their perspective on what the U.S. should do next. So Ida, I will hand it to you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks. Hello, everybody. Hello, and hi to, I know some folks are streaming in to see us that weren't able to be here in person. It's a great room of familiar faces and some new faces. So this has become one of my very favorite events that Aspen Financial Security Program does every year. And I think the conversation that we just had shows part of why that is. As we go through the next couple of days, you will see a morphing of how much of the conversation happens that we kickstart on stage and how much actually happens among the folks in the room. And I really do, again, want to thank the folks who helped us to co-found the idea of this event. I think it really is creating new kinds of dialogue, new kinds of networks, and new possibilities for an inclusive retirement savings system in the U.S. So welcome, panel. And I think that part of how we're going to build an inclusive system in the U.S. is to understand and learn from the other parts of the world who are, in some ways, I always say that we're a great net exporter of good retirement, inclusive savings system ideas. And so we'll get into that a little bit today. So we've already introduced the panel. Thank you all for being here. And I want to actually start with Michael, because I think a couple of things have happened recently for us in the U.S. We hit a milestone with passing the Secure Act, which was a long time coming. And in some ways, that was an incredible accomplishment. And yet, as you can hear from the last panel, there's still a long way to go in terms of that kind of retirement savings system that's going to create even more inclusion and more financial security for folks. So I wonder what your first take is, both on the celebratory milestones we hit with Secure and the frontier that we still have to look at.
Yeah, no, thanks, and thanks for having me. Yeah, so just to give background, a little bit of background, we started working on the Secure Act in its kind of original format in 2009. The final product was a grab bag of mostly very minor provisions that were, subtle tweaks to various rules here and there, but it was the result of about a decade of discussion on the Hill, lots and lots of advocacy from the industry and others to try and come to a bipartisan package that had general support from everybody. Not every provision had support from every member. There were certainly controversial provisions, but the goal in putting it together when it originally started in the early 2010s was to take provisions that had Republican and Democratic support, find all of them that existed, and stick them into a bill. And then over time, a few more were added. There were some provisions that broke down and were controversial between various industries, but they had bipartisan support. So I mark that as the passage as a pretty big achievement. The folks that worked on it for years and years to try and get it across the finish line, and the staff that worked over the holidays, basically up until Christmas, trying to get that done. It's a pretty monumental achievement. That said, it's a fairly small bill in the grand scheme of things. It doesn't do a whole lot. There are some minor tweaks to how you can organize plans. There's minor admin changes. There's a little bit of fiduciary relief and for related to lifetime income, some disclosure changes. It's not a sea change in the retirement system. It is a very small incremental step that I would put in that category of bills. It's just kind of good government cleanup on a lot of the issues. It's not to say they're not important provisions, and a lot are. They're not revolutionary, and not everyone wants revolution. So that was the palatable package. I think even 10 years down the line, you're still going to have a lot, absent any additional change, you're still going to have a lot of the issues that Secure was hoping to address will still be problems. You're still going to have a lack of coverage for certain segments of the population, because regardless of what you kind of do to make on the admin side a little easier, there's still going to be some unreachable populations. And we're still going to have questions about the decumulation phase on retirement and how to do that better, if it can be done better. And so I guess my takeaway from Secure was it was great to see Congress do something. It's an incremental step forward, but there's still a fair amount of work to be done.
And I think before we kind of bring in the rest of the panel, when you look at there is other active legislation that has maybe some bigger sights on the kinds of addressing the kinds of gaps that we were talking about, at least in the retirement system from the last piece. So could you, for folks that are listening and learning about retirement, one of the things I think that Karen mentioned is that part of our goal here is to make this conversation about retirement policy more accessible and have more parts of our country participating in this conversation. So many are still getting up to speed. It can be incredibly detailed and wonky in some ways, but actually just super important to all of those issues we were just talking about. So, and when I first met you as well, thinking back to your, 2 or 3 bosses ago for you with Senator Harkin as well, like what are some of the bigger idea policy pieces that are in play right now, or at least on deck? And I think Senator Coons has some work. Portman and Cardin have some things. Senator Wyden has some things. So maybe just quickly, I know a lot of folks in the room know this, but just for those who don't, so that we're all starting with a level playing field. What are some of the other policy sites that we see, maybe in brief?
Yeah.
Right
So I think I would put these in 3 buckets. There's a category of legislation that tries to ensure that there's universal access to a savings plan of some sort at the workplace. This is the leading contenders here are bills sponsored by Richard Neal, who's the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, a Democrat from Massachusetts. And they're concepts that Mark's worked on for a long time, that others have worked on, that would create a requirement that employers put people into a plan, or at least give them the option of a plan or IRA or some vehicle. There's a whole bunch of different flavors of this, but generally a bucket that covers universal coverage and making sure that everyone has access. There's a whole bunch of different flavors of that. Then there's a bucket of bills that really looks at trying to bolster retirement security for lower and moderate income people. And those are proposals like providing a refundable tax credit for savings, some sort of match. We have a tax credit now, but it's not refundable, so it's not all that useful to low-income people. Or I'd put it into that bucket as well, expanding Social Security, which I think the Democratic caucus at least has unified around largely. And then there's a kind of a third category of bills, which are back to those kind of grab bag, the grab bag of miscellaneous provisions that are small administrative tweaks that are trying to make the system operate better or serve purposes other than just solely retirement. And in that category, I think one of the leading bills is, for example, allowing employers to match, to use their plan in concert with people's student loan payments to try and give younger folks the ability to save through an employer match while still paying off their loans. Kind of a whole basket of bills that basically says, we've got this retirement system here, and it's good for this one purpose. Can we use it for something else, or can it be used to supplement something else?
And some of the liquidity issues that Ray talked about are part of those provisions as well.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
So Will, I'm going to come to you next because of the two gentlemen sitting on stage with us who in other countries, you've most recently grappled with some of the ways to bring a country along to reform a system, to grapple with some of the big questions that we just talked about on the prior panel. And I think you tried to, there were some Band-Aids in your system for a while as well. So could you describe a little bit of what and when the UK system really did take on the kinds of things that Michael talked about in that first bucket, the universal access and some of the ways that people have adequate savings over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess maybe I should say that we are a great net importer of your ideas, primarily that have been developed over here. So the big, I mean, just in descriptive terms first, I mean, you know, the UK system now is a little bit like a kind of hybrid between some of the state auto-IRA programs with a sprinkling of kind of open MEP logic over the top. So we have an auto-enrollment mandate on all employers. They have to enroll eligible workers into a plan. If the worker stays in, the employer also has to make a contribution to that plan. But on the supply side, the kind of dominant form of provision for those employers has become much like your open MEP model, so large, sort of independent, trust-based models that can take any number of employers into a kind of single plan structure. And we have Nest, which is where I'm from, which is the government sort of funded and sponsored open MEP, which is kind of one of the options employers have to fulfil that obligation. But many don't use it. Many use market-based MEP-like solutions or kind of insurance plans. So essentially, what we've built is a pretty universal system in terms of getting people into plans of some kind and using the kind of behavioural nudges of auto-enrolment. Pretty universal still in terms of the numbers of people staying in. So there are some pockets of the population who opt out in greater numbers or who aren't inside that system, but by and large we have fairly close to universal access.
Yeah, thanks. And it's what, been 6 years with now?
2012 the
2012.
rollout started. Yeah. And just picking up on a couple of things that Michael said and that you were saying, you know, it's definitely worth saying that we tried some other stuff first. And we tried some of the more kind of the smaller and more incremental things first. We certainly tried purely supply-side led solutions, so trying to make sure that there was a thing that employers could give access to on a kind of if you build it, they will come principle, which didn't really work in terms of driving up participation, but I think were absolutely crucial to building a consensus around more radical interventions later, because we were able to kind of show that more moderate interventions didn't really get the job done, and that enabled more people to coalesce around some of the kind of slightly bolder elements of our program, things like the employer mandate for contributions.
Great, thank you. And Nick, just for history's sake, my first retirement savings actually took place in Australia, in Melbourne. I was a graduate student to expose too much of my history, but let's just say when superannuation was starting, I was a grad student and a temp when you guys were privatizing electricity industry. And so my first retirement savings was in the Australian superannuation system, and I was a gig worker with a nest of retirement savings that unfortunately fortunately or unfortunately, since I wasn't a citizen and I did move back to America, it really helped me get rerouted back here and have a pretty epic drive across the country too. So anyway, so much we'll
well,
talk
you can
about.
thank me for that.
I want to thank you.
I insisted all you foreign workers should be part of our
So
system.
I just want to say, so it goes back a few years now that Australia did contend with these same big issues, and did also land on a universal access, but it's a little different than the UK's. So maybe you could put out some of the main features for us.
Yeah. Quickly, I've got a cold, by the way. Nothing worse. I left Tasmania. I flew in last night, 24 hours on an aeroplane, 3 stopovers. Fortunately for me, coronavirus outbreak in Tasmania after I left. The only advantage on that long trip was that no one wanted to sit next to me because I had
and we're all going to move off the stage now.
A sniff and a cough. I'm explaining it now because over the next 3 days I do not want to keep having to say to people I have not got coronavirus. Look, I started relatively unusually for a politician. I was in politics for 22 years, but I was a fund executive of 2 funds in Australia at the time when compulsion, compulsory membership of a defined contribution system was introduced in 1987. I should say I'm a pragmatic member of the Australian Labor Party. It's a mildly left of centre party. I'm on the right of the party, strong believer in fiscal discipline, government intervening in a capitalist system where it's appropriate, very strong safety nets. And I use the word compulsion deliberately because I know it's a nightmare, horror in America to mention that. But Australia has some interesting characteristics which I think are useful to explain why we've done what we've done. I'm a great believer, very deep interest in history and politics and understanding different cultures. And there are some commonalities on reform, I think, but you do need to understand culture. And Australia very briefly believes in compulsion, but in a capitalist system. And fundamentally that goes back to 60 years of being a convict-built society. People laugh and smile at this, but Australia's an immigrant country, 200 years of migrants, and it was built on a convict ethos of control, direction. And it has it is a unique political culture. So in a convict society, the convicts were dumped into Australia. You didn't put them in prison by and large. I mean, they couldn't escape from Tasmania or Australia. How could you get away from it? And you were made to work, and you worked for the government for 5 days a week, and you were then required to work in the private sector for yourself and for the very small private sector that then existed. So it was a curious blend of government command control, government doing everything for you, education, building the roads, providing the soldiers, very authoritarian society where government did a lot of the fundamental things, and a curious contradiction in Australian culture where Australians have total disrespect and dislike for politicians, authority, police. So it's a very peculiar set of contradictory. Australians expect government to do things, unlike the United States. Australians expect government to do things, but Australians do not want government to run things. And that's all part of our political culture of the first 50 or 60 years. Then migration. We're still the fastest growing population of any advanced economy in the world, primarily driven by migration. I stress migration, not illegal entrance. The other point I'd make, and I always do like to refer to this, despite what I think is relatively successful in Australia in terms of egalitarianism, ethos, fairness, relatively equitable distribution of income, there is one significant sector that are severely disadvantaged. That's our native, Indigenous, Aboriginal population. If you look at the outcomes there, they're amongst the worst of any advanced economy in the world. Worse than the outcomes for Inuits in Canada, Maoris in New Zealand, and your Native Americans. And it's something to bear in mind in the context of a relatively successful society. Compulsion. Australia has compulsory voting. First country in the world with compulsory seatbelts. Compulsory testing for alcohol content. And interestingly, having the most, I think a really interesting illustration of compulsion, having moved from the most open access gun ownership to very quickly when people believed in society that government had to solve the problems that you still grapple with here, almost overnight, some of the most restrictive gun laws in the world. It's quite a fascinating culture. To come to pensions, I mean, we have in 86, 87, a basic safety net, government, flat state pension, universal. And on top of that, for the very lucky 3 out of 10 Australians, a defined benefit system, public servants, middle higher income earners, and a fortunate few in the private sector, mainly in senior executive management, finance sector. I'm a very strong critic of defined benefit systems, by the way, a very strong critic. It's a really interesting example of the capture of retirement income systems by middle higher income earners post-World War II. I'll come back to that very briefly.
I'm gonna ask us to, I just want to hear the key features of it. And
Key features.
Because I want to get us, some of these other pieces I think would be great in dialogue.
Sure. The key building block in Australia was about fairness, about coverage, about spreading universally an initial 3% defined contribution to all working Australians. And that was the fundamental debate. It was kept very narrow, very focused, and then there have been a whole succession of reforms to follow on that. Higher contributions, very robust governance, increased contributions, closure of defined benefits, including in the public sector. That all followed. So in Australia, it was all about the central issue of fairness, increasing coverage to the 7 out of 10 Australians in the private sector, overwhelmingly women, low middle income, casual employment, etc. And even then, keep the political debate very simple. And then when you've got to go, inevitably in my view, go down the pathway of much more complex, harder reforms, then you do it very gradually.
Thanks. So 2 things I heard that I want to flag and go into a next conversation. One that you just mentioned, and Will, I know we've talked about this before, that comparing the Pillar 2 private sector savings systems of the countries, you very much have to also understand that there are differences in that social insurance layer in the 3 countries, in the US, in the UK, and in Australia. So we were never saying that the US would model on anything else here, but the movement toward consensus that we had to get our arms around addressing the holes in the system, and moving toward both political consensus and industry engagement in that conversation. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the story of that. And Michael, I also want you to reflect on. I want you to listen to Will and Nick, and then I want you to reflect on that in terms of where we are in this country. And then I'd actually like that to be one of the conversations we are mindful of in the room and talking about together in a few minutes. So do you want us to just say a little bit about the political, what it took?
Yeah, really happy to. And I'm going to just really quickly plug. So we just published a couple of weeks ago some research, which essentially is all about this question. So the research is about what were the conditions under which the UK's pension reform agenda was able to take the shape that it took and to sustain through its implementation period. It's on our website, nestinsight.org.uk. It will answer this question in much more depth than I can in this panel, but I would recommend it. There's some really interesting stuff in there, and it picks up on a lot of what's just been said by Nick. So it kind of talks about what were the kind of 5 things that were the most important to that reform agenda taking shape. And one of them, the last one it talks about, is the importance of the design of reforms being consistent with the political economy and welfare history of the country in which you are reforming the system. So really the UK reforms are a reinvigoration for the 21st century of the Beveridge social contract that was developed in the 1930s and 40s. I think it's really important to recognise that Stefan's here, the Swedish system is going to look different from the UK system, is going to look different from the American system, because there are cultural values and social historical values that will need to be upheld for consensus to build around a set of changes. So that was one of the big, that kind of historical consistency was one of the findings of that research. I guess the rest is very much, as you say, really about the role of consensus building as an active component of how do you build something that can sustain both large P political consensus. So there was a huge amount of effort in developing the UK reforms to bring in politicians from all sides. You know, in spite of the fact that at the time there was a very strong majority Labour government, it was nonetheless kind of understood that this system needed to last for a generation or more, and there were going to be different governments overseeing that, and so you had to start with a degree of agreement at the political level, but then also consensus at the sort of non-political level, the sort of key stakeholders, interest groups, and the general public. And so the Independent Pensions Commission we had in the UK, which sort of sparked the reform programme, really also started that consensus idea. It was three people. One was drawn from kind of industry, one was drawn from the labour movement, one was drawn from academia. So straight away you're building
Kept it small.
It was small. It was because it was small. It was very effective. It was very, very senior, very credible people with great reputations. And so I think that idea right from the start that you needed buy-in from all of the different bits of society that were relevant to the retirement system to get change through the retirement system. So I think those I mean, there's lots of other things in the research, but those things, sort of consistency with the historical design of the system, not trying to kind of completely change the shape to something different, and building a consensus at kind of all levels were really massive.
And from the beginning of it to the end, was it the same party in power, or did you actually have this through political change?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things about our reform program, I guess, so it was legislated for under a Labour government. It came into being under a coalition Conservative Liberal Democrat government. The rollout finished under a majority Conservative government. So any number of times it could have been rolled back, and it wasn't. And kind of not only that, but it was conceived of in the pretty much the longest uninterrupted period of economic growth the UK had ever seen, and rolled out in the aftermath of the worst economic crisis the world had seen in 90 years. And unlike huge other tracts of social welfare reform, was left pretty much untouched in design through that crisis. So, and that is absolutely a function of the consensus that was built at the start. Kind of everyone recognised this was a good way to go, the right way to go. Took a lot of effort to get there, but because they recognised it was able to sustain those political changes and those economic changes in a way that lots of other policy agendas just weren't.
That's fascinating, the level of through line that you just talked about. Nick, again, for Australia, thinking back to the political context of the time and what it took to get the ball rolling and to close the deal on the basic reforms that we know have been built on over time.
Well, no consensus. Very much a newly elected Labor government in 1983, as I say, very mildly left of centre. Three major promises. We were in a deep recession, massive economic reform, but we didn't promise that, by the way. That all followed subsequently over the following 13 years. Three very simple promises. Mandatory superannuation for all, mandatory health system for all, and a wage compact. Very high inflation, serious economic recession, a Labor government elected. So three very simple key promises. No detail, no consensus, top down, driven by our then Prime Minister, Treasurer, and the leaders, interestingly, of the trade union movement. Very different world now in terms of union coverage, etc., and influence. But those three key promises, and delivered in 3 years, lots and lots of detail and all, and on delivering on those promises, that government almost defeated. In fact, it would have lost and been defeated after one term, partly because of those reforms, and then because it was re-elected then and was a long-term government for 13 years, the very strong opposition to a mandatory compulsory DC system in Australia. It was condemned by the Conservative then opposition as socialism in our time, communism, takeover of the economy by government and unions. But when Labor was defeated in 1996, the new system had become so popular, and this included the health reforms too, by the way, that the then incoming Conservative government committed not to reverse the two, lots of economic reform and other reform, but the compulsory superannuation DC system and a compulsory health system for all. No, keep it as it is. Occasional attempts to nibble away at the edges, but very unpopular. One thing I would say about the Australian DC system is it's delivered through the private sector. There was a significant debate within the Labor Party about going down a government fund and even having a nest-type government run, at least for part of the system. But we came to the pragmatic conclusion that if we went down that track, the system would not survive. A Conservative government would release it, and in fact would reverse it. In fact, it is with some irony that the current Conservative government in Australia set up a future fund, which is to pay its privatised assets to pay for DB, closed public sector DB liabilities in Australia, is arguing that that should be extended at the expense of the current private sector superannuation system. It's quite ironic that a party from the right are now arguing for a socialist solution. But, you know, then politics has got lots of ironies and mix-ups in today's world. And it was fundamentally fought on that fairness principle. The old system was unfair. It conferred a significant benefit to the public sector workforce and middle higher income earners in the private sector. You know, the average Australian, 7 out of 10 were on a basic, and our state pension is very modest by OECD standards. It's quite low. And all the tax breaks, and they were very significant then, the so-called tax incentives, which are actually a subsidy, flowed overwhelmingly to the middle and higher income earners. And that this was unfair. Now, we didn't tackle those problems of DBs and the skewering of tax incentives and subsidies to higher income earners then. They've subsequently been tackled and pared back. It was all about focusing the debate on getting that coverage. We did a lot of polling at the time, obviously, you know, you're in government, you keep an eye on the polls. When the mandatory system was introduced, the polling was roughly 50-50 in favour or against. There was strong opposition from segments of the business community and, interestingly, from the finance sector, particularly those who had a vested interest in the defined benefit system, and strong opposition from the banks, who did not want a diversion of saving from bank accounts into superannuation accounts. Relatively small but significant opposition from what I'd call the far left and far right. The far left arguing for a higher state pension, and the far right arguing for more subsidies and voluntarism and incentives, and that'll solve the problem. So, you know, that's the...
very different picture.
Yeah, very top down, no discussion, no debate. I mean, I was part of the political elite that determined this would be a policy at the election. Keep it simple and go for it. And we're in government and we're going to do it and smash all the opposition. And we did it. Just on the polling...
But over time it became popular.
To finish on this point, the polling. We then polled a year after we'd introduced the mandatory system at 3%. And it had 85% public support. Went from 50 to 85% in 1 year, like universal health coverage. Went from 50%, again, that was very controversial, to 85%. Again, substantially delivered through private sector institutions. Why? And the beauty of it was when every Australian, not every Australian, you know, the vast majority started getting their
even a temp worker from America
statement. They got their statement, and even if it said I've got $200 or $1,000 in my DC account. Now there are lots of challenges in
Let's
this.
not go there right now. I'm going to
Okay.
finish your point, and I'm going to bring in Michael.
Lots of challenges. The beauty of it was people said, I'm getting something that I never had before. It might only be a couple of $100. The fees might be excessive, all the sorts of, I'm getting something I never had before and no one's going to take it away from me. And
Thank
the
you.
same on going to the doctor and not having to pay for it.
Thanks. So I would just say, Michael, discuss, but I do think that...
Talk about whatever you want.
Look, this is fundamentally the question we're all grappling
By the way,
with. How
no
do we
government
get-
in Australia has a majority in the Senate. I sat in the Senate. I had to deal with all of this horrific nightmare legislation and all the deals you've got to cut.
Yeah.
No government has a majority.
Yep.
You know, you've got to threaten special elections. You've got to go in hard. One other political, you can generally, whether you're from the right or the left, whatever your political philosophy values are, a government can generally get away with one very large reform in each term in government, whether you're from the right or the left. One major reform, you can get away with it, you go in hard, you sell it, and you'll probably survive the next election.
Yep. So I think thank you. I think that context is, we're laying out some one very interesting cocktail conversation later. So that's part of this, is just really, come up and ask more about the history of other DC plans. I think that's important. Michael, I think with you, I'm thinking both to when you staffed Senator Harkin back in the day, like there's very few champions that this is their number one priority, retirement policy in our government. So I'm trying to imagine either scenario. I don't know if you see a clear path for the U.S. conversation, but what do you think is likely? What do you think is possible? And actually, this is the kind of conversation I'm going to ask the room to start talking about as well.
So this is when you want me to bum everyone out. I think
give
my jaded view of
Congress. I think
Congress.
the level of cynicism. Two things. I think many people in the room will come back and say, "Wow, I think actually Secure Act has more potential than you think." I think that's a feeling. There's a lot of diverse feelings in the room.
Sure.
There's a lot of places where the market may be leading in terms of starting to understand the need for a more inclusive system. But bring on your cynicism. That's okay.
Yeah. No. I Secure Act isn't revolutionary, but I think it's good. It's a good, everything, almost everything in there's good. It's a positive step. I mean, we just have a political system where it's just very challenging to get anything through Congress. It's even more challenging in state legislatures these days than you would think. And we need two things to get something done. We either need a crisis that absolutely must be fixed and addressed. We've got the drivers have been pension funding crises in the past. You either need that or you need unanimity around something. And both of those things are very difficult to get. Not that you go after a crisis, but they occur very rarely, and you can only usually do legislation that addresses the crisis and then hope to tack other stuff on. And then if we want to do something a little more proactive, you really do kind of need unanimity. And around retirement, there are very few members of Congress that actually care about retirement too much. They don't focus on it. It's not a big deal. I bet you could count them on one hand in the Senate and maybe two hands in the House, so not a ton of folks. And there's a divide there, too. If you talk to, I would say, the vast majority of Democrats, while they will say that the private sector is great and everyone should have access to a retirement plan, what they really care about is Social Security, not about the private sector retirement system. And they will prioritize that over everything. So you kind of split the liberal side of the aisle between the folks that are Social Security or bust, and then folks that are more private sector focused, and then you have kind of the conservative side, not really wanting government involvement in either system, to be honest, and not really, not always interested in kind of some of the more maybe some of the more progressive policy options like compulsory systems and things like that. You just get a system that's paralyzed largely on these issues, unless we can get unanimity. Fortunately or unfortunately, there is a crisis coming down the road. We have a pension funding crisis for multi-employer plans that it's going to affect millions of people. So there'll be an opportunity to legislate there. And there are some additional kind of consensus items that weren't part of Secure that people have gravitated towards and are talking about and have been talking about for a couple of years. So there's an opportunity there. It's just a very difficult one. I think most of the innovation at this point is coming on the private sector side to the extent they can do so within the complex regulatory framework we have.
I know Will wants to jump in with a comment. I can see it. No? Okay. But I guess my
many
question to you
possible
is,
comments.
given the first panel and the painting of the gaps, the levels of insecurity, financial insecurity that are potentially now having visible political implications, does this not start to constitute a crisis? Or is there, so I guess I would ask that, and I think this is a question for the room as well. So, if not that, what? And I think to just respond to your level of kind of clear-eyed look at where we are in terms of political will, is there anything additional that either of our international friends would say to kind of, did it look unlikely until it happened internationally, or was it kind of inevitable that change was happening? So I think those are a couple of, sorry, those are a little bit random, but like what actually does constitute crisis, and does it sneak up on you, this level of kind of ability to take action?
Well, you probably gathered from my comments. I mean, the big challenge is longevity and the dependency ratio. I mean, it is killing defined benefit systems. And the reality is a pension is a minimum income payment, universal in most advanced economies, that is covering people for a longer and longer period. And it's relatively generous compared to other government payments pre-retirement. That's what's killing pension systems as we understand. In Australia, if you live to 65, a male will live, on average, will die at age 84, a female will die at average age 89. So effectively, you're paying people not to work, a minimum income for 20 to 25. That's what's killing us.
You're saying the crisis in the Pillar 1 pension is what's going to precipitate changes in the DC process.
DB, it's killing DBs.
Great. Let's go to Will. Hold on one second. Sure. Let's go grab him as well. And we're going to get 2 questions in, and then I think we're going to wrap this up.
So I want to try and get to both of your points. So is there a crisis? Was it inevitable? So the Pensions Commission in the UK spent over a year writing a 300-page report that didn't recommend anything. Okay, all it did was
Sounds very familiar.
All it did, well, except in a really positive way, because all it did was it said, if we simply roll the current regulatory framework forward 30 years, the average pensioner will be 30% poorer in 30 years' time than the average pensioner is today. And here is a massive evidential proof that is the case. And if you don't like that, you can do one of 3 things. You can pay more in taxes for a more generous Pillar 1, you can save more for a more effective Pillar 2, or you can all work longer. Now let's just talk about that. And then for a year, we just talked about that, right? And there were debates at a political level, at an industry level, at a public level that said, okay, well, we probably all agree we don't want pensioners on average to be 30% poorer. Do we want 3% more of GDP in taxes to be transferred to pensioners in the future? Do we all want to save X amount more? Do we want to work till we're 75? Because if you want to pick any single strategy from those 3, that was the kind of scale you were talking about. And it made it almost inevitable that the strategy was going to be a mix of those 3, because no one was going to accept that degree of fiscal transfer. No one was going to accept the kinds of levels of individual private saving that we needed on its own to fix the problem. And no one was going to accept people working until they were 75. Yeah. And so in that relatively short period of time, a couple of years, we went from kind of crisis, what crisis, to we know we are just picking from a small menu of things that are going to fix this problem, and that's where the kind of consensus built.
But it also strikes me that it's a little bit of a call for what Jeff was asking for earlier, which is, where is the discussion? Where is the dialogue? We're really going to grapple with a choice set that starts to, the more you grapple with it, the more the inevitability of having to decide on something starts to come into play.
But there's an enormous amount of discussion. I mean, I've been coming here for the last 20 years regularly. People listen with great interest. I was involved for a couple of years with Tony Blair and the Labor government, lots of ministers and Lord Turner. I think the challenge, I mean, I was an advisor to the Bank of Greece 5 years ago, and I hate to see any country get to the catastrophe that Greece got. I think it's about starting reform early, focusing on the key issue of coverage, simplicity, not dealing with all the other issues around sustainability of DB, pension ages, etc. Deal with them afterwards. Now, the problem is most other countries, the US, etc., are running out of time. The longer you leave reform, the harder it gets, the bigger the reforms have to be. And I think my sadness, and it is a sadness, left of centre parties in most economies are locked into preserving the basic social security state pension. Don't change it. Don't increase the access age. Keep paying it longer and longer. And they're locked into DBs, particularly in the public sector. That's left of centre parties broadly, and they're not willing to accept any fundamental change around that. And the right of centre parties, it's all about, well, you're lucky what you've got.
So it's a little bit of where Michael was talking about here
that's
for
right.
that. You guys, I know we'll have, I'd love to hear a couple of the questions that are in the room. And then again, if we don't have time to talk about all of them right now among us, we will have the next couple of days to do so. So questions, comments, insights from the room? Not all three of those, Josh. You can have a question, a comment, or an insight. One.
How about just a question?
Okay.
Okay, Josh Cotbaum, Brookings. Nick, I'm curious. You mentioned that in Australia, there still was room for private defined benefit pensions, whereas, as you know, they are an endangered species in the U.S. and the UK.
They're dead in Australia.
Okay. Pardon?
They're dead in Australia.
Oh, okay, so it's consistent.
It went 20, 25 years ago, yeah.
In that case, question withdrawn.
Other
The big
questions?
difference in Australia is DBs in the public sector everywhere were closed 10 or 15 years ago.
Other question, comment? Hope for the way that this conversation loops back to number one as we go through the next couple of days.
Come on, have a go.
I know, it's good. Well, I would say
there's someone at the
Oh,
back
yeah,
there.
great. Lou,
So
introduce yourself. Sorry.
Lou Minsky. I'm the CEO of DCA, the Defined Contribution Institutional Investment Association. I guess I'll just build on Michael's comment and say, I don't think we have to wait for a crisis, and I think we have broad agreement and consensus. I mean, we heard the first panel all say basically the same thing. I think last year, Karen and I even agreed. So it's not rocket science, right? I mean, we need to get to a place where we just reframe the conversation away from compulsion toward inclusion, right? And we can all agree, I think, that the system needs to be broadly inclusive, and so let's get it done. I mean, that's my comment.
It's a really fascinating summary of the first panel that everyone agreed on everything. That wasn't entirely my reading of it, but yeah.
But to be fair to your political leadership,
We're going to have to wrap up, but yes, if there's a
in the
quick way to
contact
do
I've
that.
had, I do think there is a deep understanding of the challenges of retirement incomes amongst most politicians. Very few experts, if you can call it that, want to deal with the issue because it's all such a nightmare of hardship. Just one final comment. I mean, in terms of the public pension in Australia, basic state pension, when the Labor left of centre party had to make two very, very unpopular reforms. One, it increased the pension age from 65 to 67. It's now 66, going to 67 in 2 years. And we cut benefits by introducing a means test. One of the few countries to do that. That's a severe check on the costs of our state benefit. And again, it was terribly controversial. I mean, everyone on a middle higher income was screaming blue murder, and we almost lost the subsequent election. We're one of the few countries that means tests our state pension. And it's a very tough means test around any other income and assets other than your own home.
So Will,
I wish we could get that money.
I do want to stop us, and I'm sorry to do
Sure.
that, but I know we have a little break, which we'll probably cut into a little bit. But I just want to thank the panel. Again, the beginning of a conversation. I think we're in a different place where we can be listening and learning from what's happening in other countries right now as well. And so I want to thank you for your experience, and thank you both for agreeing to be around for the next couple of days as we start to pick your brains in more depth about the choices and trade-offs that face us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Please join me in thanking our panel. And now we do, in fact, have a break until 4:40, and we'll see you back here for our final discussion. Thanks. Refreshments outside. Okay, let's go ahead and get moving back into the room. All right, welcome back. I notice our panel is already up here and kind of having a conversation without us, which is a bummer. Ray, were you telling a joke? Oh, man, we missed it. So welcome back, whether you're here in the room or on the webcast. So for our final discussion of the afternoon, I previewed this in my remarks at the beginning, but we wanted to invite a group of private sector leaders to the stage because in the US, the retirement savings system is driven by the combination of tax policy and regulatory oversight alongside a supply chain of private sector asset managers, record keepers, employers, and more. And as I previewed at the top, right now, many of the leaders of the companies involved in the retirement savings system are actively calling for a rethink of our current version of capitalism. We heard some back and forth about, how well that's working in the first session. And some are explicitly questioning Milton Friedman's philosophy of shareholder primacy, proposing that other groups of stakeholders, including employees, be elevated to match shareholder status. So for us at the Financial Security Program, given the role that retirement savings can play in closing some of those wealth gaps that are so pernicious and detrimental to family financial security, it feels like a really important question. What does this conversation that's happening right now in our society mean for retirement savings? And what should we expect to see out of stakeholder capitalism when it comes to retirement savings and security? So we've invited a group of leaders from these companies to tell us what they think it means. So on the stage already, in order, we have Ann Ackerley, the head of the retirement group at BlackRock, Dave Ireland, the head of global defined contribution at State Street, and yep, there we go. I'm so short, I can't see. It's Ann. Ann Lester, the head of retirement solutions at JP Morgan Asset Management, and Phil Waldeck, the CEO of the Workplace Solutions Group at Prudential Financial. And moderating the discussion will be a face I'm guessing many of you recognize. His name is Ray Suarez. He has too many notable former roles to list, so we'll go with journalist and author and the host of World Affairs, a weekly podcast from KQED FM. So thank you so much to all of you, and Ray, Jay, I'll give it to you.
Well, deep into this era of self-funded old age pensions, the news is not good. In laissez-faire America, saving for retirement is still very much a choice. Save for how long, save how much, and once you have saved, how inviolable is that account? It's a choice many simply don't make at all, and many others feel they simply can't make at a time of slow or no wage increases. And the system, such as it is, offers options that have not kept pace with the different ways that people earn a living, how often they change jobs, and given the choice, oh, again, there's that word, how often they cash out when they change jobs. The median American in his or her 60s has saved $172,000 for retirement. The average life expectancy for an American man is about 76. The average life expectancy for a woman is roughly 81, with a fairly modest draw of $1,200 a month. You run out of money in 15 years or so, and are probably hoping that you will not have run out of life at that same point. My generation, the baby boomers, are unleashing a gray tsunami on America, and lack of preparation, made worse by the crash of 2008, means there are going to be an awful lot of poorer seniors in our midst in their 70s, less likely, less able to work, and in straitened circumstances. The American system of retirement savings has been created by the tax code, but built and largely developed by the private sector, from employers to record keepers to asset managers. And there are tens of millions of Americans who are not engaged in or benefiting from this system. Retirement savings and security stands to benefit from the current conversation about stakeholder capitalism. In this discussion, we've invited a group of senior representatives from the asset management industry, all of whose CEOs have been public about either the need to remake capitalism or to make it work better for all the stakeholders, or supporting state-led efforts to increase access to workplace retirement savings, or acknowledging that most Americans are simply struggling with their day-to-day finances and will need more than just a 401k to be financially secure. We'll get their perspectives on what this societal conversation about capitalism means for their role in building retirement savings in all American households, and we'll want to hear from you about what you think their role ought to be. But given what we know about human behavior and the tax code and American politics, which have sort of seized up on this question, the bewildering set of externalities that you have to take into account as we talk about this, especially externalities clustered around later life in America, what do we do now? So let's start with the most basic question. Ann Ackerley, what is stakeholder capitalism?
Okay. Well, first, delighted to be here, and thank you to Aspen for inviting me and giving us this forum to talk. It's always in the past been a great way to get ideas and hopefully move forward. Stakeholder capitalism, obviously BlackRock and Larry Fink have been calling for that. It's the notion of everything is not just for the shareholder and for profit. It's you need to take all your stakeholders into account. So your employees, the communities, your suppliers, everybody has to have a role to play, and it shouldn't just all be for the benefit of the shareholder.
Fair enough, because it sounds like a phrase that's meant to flatten out my brain waves and make me breathe more comfortably. But I really want to work on that definition a little bit more. Would you, Ann Lester, define it the same way?
So I think, our CEO, Jamie Dimon, when he was head of the Business Roundtable, came out with the statement that the Business Roundtable supported many members talking about shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism. And I think that the gist of it is very much thinking about the community as well as the shareholder and saying, I think, that we will all prosper as a society when each part of our ecosystem is sharing in that prosperity. And if you very narrowly define it as only benefiting the shareholder, you are leaving out the parts of that ecosystem that in fact will make the shareholder eventually better off too. So it's maybe a fiduciary, if you will, for those of us in the industry. We like that word a lot. But it's a bit of a fiduciary overlay on that. And if we are taking care of our stakeholders as well as our shareholders will then benefit as well. But it's really communities, it's workers, it's the environment, it is that end-to-end concept.
And Natalie, do you have partners? I mean, it's one thing for people in your firm and in your industry to be talking like this, but don't you need other people to meet you halfway who are part of this whole thing?
Yeah, well, I think they are, right? I think the Business Roundtable, what was it, 180 heads of companies signed this declaration saying it really has to be about stakeholders. So I actually think there are many, many people, and in particular heads of companies, thinking about this. I might add one other thing that maybe we could think about as we think about, stakeholder capitalism, which is, what is your purpose? And I think if companies were much clearer in articulating what their purpose was, and the purpose isn't just to make profit, that would be easier for stakeholders, and it would be easier for decision making if they could articulate what is their reason for being. So I think that has to go with it.
Dave Ireland, this is normally, as both Karen and I began by saying, an area where this industry waits for cues from new legislation, from new models, and then provides the products that act as the vessel. Is it plausible at this point to just wait until government comes up with something?
I think you're right in that policy drives a lot of what we do, and it drives a lot of client behavior. But I think if I think internally about the way we manage our business, the way I run the retirement business at State Street, our mission, and this isn't new with this idea of stakeholder capitalism, our mission has always been focused on improving retirement outcomes for that end participant. So personally, I think that this actually just, our current mission is aligned with this idea. Now, what does it allow us to do as industry leaders? I think it allows us to go out and have a louder voice. Go out and engage with our clients, go out and engage with policymakers, and push a little bit harder, for this idea of change. And to Ann's point, a lot of those clients, their CEOs, the C-suite signed on for this, right? So we've got, we can go hand in hand and push for that change.
Well, certainly you can create products, and creativity is valued, but you still have to run within the lines on the track. I think you get called out, disqualified if you run wherever you want after the gun goes off.
I think that's absolutely right. I think when you think about product development, you do have to stick within those guardrails. But I think this gives us that outlet to push harder for innovation. I mean, there's been so much litigation in the retirement industry, specifically DC. You've got a lot of plan sponsors that they want to do the right thing. They're becoming more and more paternalistic, but they don't feel like they've got the right safe harbors, the fiduciary protections to take action. So this gives us the ability to go out, push harder on policymakers, to affect positive change. But it gives us the opportunity to go out and talk to those plan sponsors and say, what you're doing right now in your DC plan with target date funds and leveraging all of the benefits of automatic futures is great, but it's falling short in certain areas. It's not helping individuals translate those assets into some form of steady, guaranteed retirement income stream. How can we do that together?
Can I just add, I actually think if we wait for policy, we're going to be waiting a long time, and we heard that from Michael, and whether you argue Secure was, had a lot of change or not, we can debate that, but we can't wait for policy. And I think what we need to do here is all of us and be leaders and actually really lead. And I think one of the key things is we in the industry need to work differently, and we need to work much more together than we ever have before. And it's a pretty fragmented ecosystem, and Anybody who lives their life in it, it like blows your mind a little bit about how many players impact decisions. And so, you have 4 leaders here, and we need a lot more, and we need the not-for-profits and the employers collectively. And I think that's what stakeholder capitalism allows us to have all those conversations. But if we're going to say employers, you need to do more for your employees, we better be giving them really good solutions and good advice and good leadership and being advocates for them.
And if I can just jump in, I think the whole ESG, environmental, social governance framework has something to contribute to this conversation. And if we think about our roles as fiduciaries and stewards of capital that are trying to generate outcomes, clearly the way we frame choices when viewed in that lens, and again, regulation is also relevant in this conversation, but I do think one of the challenges, and again, I'd love to have us as an industry do, I think we are coalescing around ways of measuring and monitoring some of these things, but it's, I think the reason shareholder value or primacy or capitalism became so prevalent is it's really easy to measure, and I think so many of our decisions end up defaulting to something that's easy to measure, and then you can do it, and then you can all feel good about it. And this other stuff is it's a little fuzzy, and it's a little harder to pin down. So I do think that one way and again, I think ESG is one way we're trying to start framing these with metrics and ways of articulating value beyond a narrow sort of short-term economic quarterly earnings or something like, or shareholder price.
Well, I think there's 2 things there. I think there is one of time
You're
horizon.
just going to have to jump in, right?
Well,
I know, we're moderating ourselves now, right?
We can't help ourselves.
We've taken over, right?
But I think there's 2 things. One is one of time horizon. So, as working for private companies, yes, we work for the shareholder. That is our fiduciary obligation. But that shareholder outcome is now a longer time horizon, whether it be your own employees, whether it be the community, whether it's with not-for-profits. It is a more complex system, and those shareholder results or returns will be directly linked to the behaviors of companies, and whether it is broader policy leadership, why I think all of us are here in this room, not just on this stage, but if I think I work for an insurer/asset manager, we make promises that last decades. If we had a quarterly earnings focus only, we wouldn't have the right approach for that long time horizon. So I think all large American corporations are in a bright spotlight now with their own employees, with their regulators, with their communities, where it's not only the right thing to do, it's the right thing for the shareholder, which is where that now lines up. And in an environment where we're not going to hold our breath waiting for legislation, in an environment where, all right, what can we do that may be more incremental in terms of a public-private partnership with the system we have, and have more North Stars that we can agree on in terms of the policy we want, even if it's not going to happen as fast as we want.
Well, let's talk more about time horizon, because I think it's one of the critical aspects of this conversation. In 2020, here we are, sort of 50 years into the transition away from defined benefit to self-funded retirement. 401k, the accidental vessel for tens of millions of workers. This was a codicil in the tax code that was never meant to apply to the vast mass of workers, but was written in there as a goodie for highly compensated employees, and ended up being the retirement system for tens of millions of Americans. And when you saw how many people, for instance, cashed out when the market crashed, I watched that and I thought, this is exactly the problem. These people aren't money managers. They're not stock pickers. There's somebody who we've handed a pile of paper to and said, here, see you in 40 years, good luck, and told them to fund their own retirements. It was astounding, but we let it happen. And now, I will turn 63 tomorrow. I'll wait for your birthday wishes till later. But now I can actually see the end of the finish line, and I'm thinking, wow, a lot of my peers simply are not ready. And that's not paternalistic, and it's not condescending. It's just a reality. We created this crazy system and said to them, okay, good luck here. make the right decisions, fund the right amount, never cash out when you change jobs. But if we told you couldn't, you'd tell us that we're being overbearing and paternalistic. This is a crazy thing we embarked on. And yet here we are. And yet here we are, Phil Waldeck. And yes, you will. If you say it's not enough, it's clear it's not enough. Saying it's not enough is not enough.
No, saying it's not enough is not enough. And by the way, your time horizon, they keep moving the deadline on you because you're living longer. So you might think you got 15 years, but maybe you have 20. And so I think longevity increasing at the same time as that environment makes it harder yet. So what do we need to do? We need to get more people in the system. We need to expand coverage, which is why incrementally Secure was helpful. We need to get more employers that are using auto-enrollment and target date funds. We need to have better solutions that are drawdown solutions, as David referenced earlier. And we need to have a real serious discussion. I think if not all of our firms, most of them have supported AutoK or the required coverage for all but the smallest employers, and it's time for that. And if we only say, well, if we are waiting for legislation, AutoK is not going to happen in 2020. And if it happens in 2022, I'll be thrilled. But I think that is far enough away as people are approaching retirement. What can we do more with the system that we have? But that would be an example of a breakthrough in coverage, but one that's probably not going to happen fast.
I'm wondering if it's kind of game over for my cohort anyway, and we're really talking about making sure this doesn't happen again for people who are now in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. I'm serious.
Well, I think a key part for your generation, and this is not the scope normally of the workplace, but it's making sure Social Security is sustainable. And your generation, and I'm part of it, we need to have that foundation to keep people out of poverty, and then we need a private system that is built on top of it.
Yeah, keeping Social Security safe, we've done a lot of work on that so far. Yeah, go ahead, Ann Leslie.
I was actually going to say something kind of in line with what you said, Phil, which, I'm going to slightly reframe, but more or less say the same thing you did, so I'll try to be fast, right? There are three things that you have to do to build a private retirement system. You got to get the money in, you got to get it invested and growing, and you got to help people take it out. And I look at the reforms that were made in the Pension Protection Act to get money in. It's now considered best practice to auto-enroll, assuming you have a plan, so access is huge, and I do think, we certainly feel like Secure is a incremental but not small step in the right direction. Auto investing through a QDIA, Qualified Default Investment Alternative, a target date fund, or something like that, fixes the second one, and again, I would say Secure gave us a step in the how do we help people get the money out. Access remains, in my view, the single biggest problem. I think for people who have worked relatively consistently for an employer and relatively consistently saved and invested their money, they're probably fine. There are, unfortunately, way too many people who have either episodically moved in and out of employment or had gaps in their working for someone with a plan or had that leakage, right? So I think we as providers have done a lot of work to help improve the comfort level of our clients in adopting these features, in talking about limiting loan usage, about using all of the data that we have at our disposal to illustrate that there are some really sound things that can be done. Back to your point on litigation and regulation, right? It still is unfortunately hard sometimes for those companies to feel brave enough to do these things that are absolutely laid out in some great stuff that was done 10, 15 years ago. So to me, the question is how do we keep reinforcing that and get the access more broad?
Well,
I was going to so agree with Ann and Phil, and maybe this will be, we all agree. But one thing we should just make clear is in the world of DB, and in private sector, less than 50% of private sector workers had access to DB. So we tend to glorify it, but it wasn't a perfect system either.
Great.
And the 401k, while it was accidental, and I'm not sure we're defending it, we are saying we've improved it. It does let people change companies, and it does let people have more mobility. Now it needs to be easier to move. It shouldn't be so onerous. I agree coverage is a huge issue for us here. We know when people have access, they tend to start saving. And I'd say the other big thing that we've lost without DB is mortality risk and mortality pooling. And we, the math has changed. It's not only likely you're going to live to 85, you're going to live to 105. And with retirement still at 65, it's really hard to make the same amount of money last. So we've got to figure that piece out as well. And Secure gave us a little bit to build on. And that's why I think it's a lot about leadership and innovation and us driving it.
And I can't help on the longevity if I could just jump in.
Well.
The longevity issue, people don't live average longevity.
Right,
we live our individual longevity, and people are now faced with the consequence of being a pool of one.
Yeah.
And as an industry, both with insured, guaranteed, and non-guaranteed solutions, we have to find ways to pool that works, that's simple. Otherwise, with increasing longevity, we're going to have a lot of people, especially women, that are exposed late in life that will be in poverty.
Simple and inexpensive.
Dave, you wanted to say?
No, I was just. I mean, it's at the risk of us all agreeing. If you were to
really
ask
boring,
me,
I'm sorry.
If you were to ask me what's the number one thing that we can do, I would go back to access. It's the access issue. I mean, we heard it through Will, the experience in the UK. We look at where we are in America. Is it 40 million working Americans don't have access to a workplace retirement savings plan, and maybe that number's even growing, right? Especially with the growth in the gig economy. To put some statistics on it, there was an AARP study that says people are 15 times more likely to save if they have access to a workplace retirement payroll deduction plan. You tack on automatic features on that, it goes up to 20 times, right? So if we think about wealth creation, the drivers of wealth creation, you have to have individuals saving in order to then start compounding it. So I think largely what we've done is we've solved the middle chapters. What we need to focus on are the bookends. It's getting more people saving earlier, allowing them to compound. And then it's Phil's comments on how do you help individuals? You use the word security, right? This is about wealth accumulation, but it's also about security. It's about translating assets into some form of steady, transparent, guaranteed income, right? And I think that's when we talk to our clients, especially as DBs are going by the wayside, more and more individuals, retirees, are being forced with this question of, how am I going to spend down my assets? How am I going to make sure that those assets last the rest of my life? And frankly, what we see is that a lot of individuals, actually, they're so fearful of outliving their assets, they underconsume, right? So are there mechanisms that we can put to them, to give to them, to maximize consumption?
I wonder, as I listen to you all speak, since we're talking about the existing panoply of choices that exist for any individual worker today, whether in fact we're still behind what's happening in the workforce. Dave, you mentioned the gig economy. That's no small number of people. And you mentioned work for an employer. People have multiple employers, no employer, sporadic, seriatim employers. They don't have plans with all these different people. By having it be so heavily employer-based, are we trying to imagine our way into a system that no longer really fits the way people in large numbers? Yes, most people still go to work for a place, but boy, large numbers of people now don't.
I think one of the most intriguing things, and I'm probably going to reveal my own ignorance about the Australian system. I know enough to be dangerous, but it's the ability of the payroll deduction, assuming you have a payroll, not the employer, that makes workplace savings so powerful. It's the auto deduction from your pay packet before it hits your account that is the magic. It's not, with all due respect to any plan sponsors in the room, it's not the magic of the employer as fiduciary. It's really the ability to grab the money before it hits their, burns a hole in their pocket and out it goes. And one of the things I think is really interesting that we can learn from both the UK and Australia is this notion of a provider of this service in many other countries around the world. I mean, you can look at the Mexican Afores, you can look at all kinds of things that have a professionally managed, fiduciarily supervised thing that the employer is obligated to facilitate, right? But anybody, and depending on the system, anybody can have one, right? And to me, there's some interesting ideas there. And again, if we asked some of our clients, do they, what on their list of top 5 things they love about being an employer, I'm pretty sure providing a DC plan is not going to make the list, right? So, but it's part of the social contract people have with their employees. It's perceived as a benefit, and it's really hard to mess with that kind of stuff.
When there was, in the last presidential administration, some toying with the idea of post office-based savings accounts, something that they've had in lots of other countries in the world for a really long time, you would have thought we were talking about rolling missiles through Lafayette Square on May Day. It was, the overreaction was kind of nutty and disproportionate, and I thought, oh, some guy putting $25 in the post office is going to bring the whole house of cards tumbling down. But just the kind of inventiveness that you're all talking about seems to also be discouraged when somebody actually says, well, hey, why don't we try this thing that works in another country? Why don't we try this model, which has the benefit of not being employer-based, so when someone's changing jobs a lot in the early part of their life, they're still accumulating a little foldable wealth.
Well, I think the prior panel, I think Will, when he was describing the NEST approach, you need an approach that is able to get a bipartisan, culturally sustainable buy-in. And culturally, there's a lot of resistance in the United States to anything that smacks of a mandate, anything that is government-driven. So how can you strike the right balances to get coverage, ideally universal coverage? That's where I like the automatic K solution, but that is provided, it's proposed in a way to be provided by the private sector. That's a balancing act between a mandate but private sector. But at whatever we have, it needs to last every administration, not just the one that puts it in place.
But that balancing act is the gradualism, the incrementalism. That's part of the problem. If you say, well, we can do this, but we can't tell people they have to do it, you end up with millions of people who are 65 with no savings, which is what we have right now. If we don't immediately and once and for all change the way we talk to young people about retirement, which there's no sign of us doing, let me tell you. I have 2 kids in their 20s and one who's 30. And one knows exactly where the first dollar he ever made is. And the other ones are like, there is no retirement conversation, serious retirement conversation, unless I bring it up. But I mean, where they work, there's not really a serious retirement conversation.
If I can pull the conversation back to shareholder and stakeholder value, right? To me, one of the things we all should be doing as employers is making sure we're driving that conversation in the workplace. And I do know some plan sponsors we work with are extraordinarily serious about having that conversation. I think it's just a company by company culture. And again, that's another place we can play a leadership role, I think, is in driving that conversation.
Right. I was going to go back to the employer as well, since that is the system we have today. And stakeholder capitalism is about taking care of your employees. And I think we need to be framing it as it's a way to get a greater connection. They need to be providing, living real wages, right? Wages haven't gone up at all. They need to be providing benefits. Retirement benefits in the United States have gone down, the spend by companies over the last 15 years by 25%, according to AARP, I believe. So we've got to get employers, I think, to be doing more, and I think it's going to be through stakeholder capitalism.
And I think in a tight labor market, when you have unemployment
3.5%
or below, you have much more employer demand and need for the good of their employees and the good of their shareholders to be much more supportive of the types of policies that we're talking about.
Before Dave jumps in, let me remind you that we'll be taking questions in just a moment. Your brief, elegant, and meant to elicit a specific answer sort of question, not an oration, if you know what I mean. something that has a question mark at the end, your voice goes up a little bit, meant to elicit a response from a member of the panel. Dave, go
Yeah,
ahead.
just to Ann's comment about us kind of standing shoulder to shoulder as industry participants. I mean, I was up on the Hill earlier today, and we were meeting with policymakers, and we were talking about retirement income and the importance and some provisions that we would like them to look at. And the conversation was very general in nature versus our product specific. And the way I framed it to him, I said, listen, we're trying to get our clients to buy into religion right now. You know, we can fight about the denominations after the fact, but right now we need to see this mind shift in large scale.
Can I take it one just
Sure.
step further? Because I do think if we're gonna try to be a little bit provocative in here, it's a really fragmented industry in terms of providers, and that really just hurts American people. And I feel like there's a lot of people in this room that work in this industry. I see my friend Spencer over there. And, you know, we hit a lot of roadblocks when it isn't exactly in my interest to do something or your interest. And unless we are willing to partner and work together, it's not going to go as fast as you want it to go. And a lot of that has to do with it's not a modern system. It needs to be modernized. It needs to be more efficient. But we all need each other to provide a better system. And so I would encourage us to work together. And, you know, we've started to do it. And I know everybody else is doing it, but we have to do it more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Lori Lucas from the Employee Benefit Research Institute. Lori Lucas from the Employee Benefit Research Institute. Hi, everyone. Great panel. Excuse me. So I have a question, maybe starting with Ann, but I think all of you kind of alluded to it at some point or another.
I know.
And
So
Lester.
many
I'm looking
Anns in the room.
Ann Lester. I
How
apologize.
often does that happen?
So Ann Lester, you said you were kind of making what I heard as a case for multiple employer plans being a path for employers that would be desirable. But how does that square with the stakeholder capitalism? Because it seems to me like you're beginning to remove the employer from the benefits equation when it comes to that benefit. And we're already seeing that employers are trying to do other things like financial wellness. They seem engaged when it comes to benefits.
So I think the question is really scale and efficiency and a robust, repeatable product. And I mean, okay, this is not a super short answer, but I'll try to make it fast. My grandparents used to drive back and forth from LA to Kansas every summer. And my mother said she swore my grandmother knew where every single McDonald's was along the way because she knew exactly what she was going to get to eat. And this was in the 50s and the 60s, right? And the bathrooms were always clean. And now, and I'm not, you know, relating our multiple employer plans that we're hopefully all going to be building to McDonald's, but there is, I think, something to be said, and again, I look to Australia and the UK, where you're seeing consolidation into a streamlined, modern, clean, technology savvy, portable system that, you know, the consequence of which is you might have to let go of a few quirks that are specially designed for your special needs as a very, very large employer, but the sort of Pareto optimization or the 80-20 rule around you get a pretty darn good thing for a fraction of the complexity. I suspect the benefits of that will wildly outweigh the sacrifice that might be made. And now I'm also assuming that the employer is still going to say, it's important for me to offer a plan and it's important for me to have my employees engaged in the plan, and that is a commitment I will continue to make.
And contribute to a plan.
And to contribute to the plan. All of those things I'm assuming will still be present. I'm just saying I don't have to do it myself.
But I suspect that the system you're describing could be a voluntary system in which you have the efficiency of open multiple employer plans that could drive costs down with standardization. And then employers that want to have their own and see value, especially with their engagement with their employees. That's part of the outcome that those employers want, so that they have a strong business. I think the private system still survives and thrives in that environment because there's an additional model that's hopefully more cost efficient, especially for smaller employers who are, you know, paying way more.
Yes.
Nick Sherry, to the point, 2 questions, provocative. Post-retirement, This American loving with target date. Why would you be in bonds and cash for 20 to 25 years from retirement to the average day you die? Why? Secondly, the paucity of savings for low middle income earners in the private sector. Many of them would have far more significant savings in their own home, i.e. equity drawdown. That's the reality here and in Australia. 4 times the level of saving in a person's home than in their DC account in Australia. So what role do you see equity drawdown playing inevitably given the financial pressures?
Maybe I'll start with your second question. The drawdown opportunity is real, but the structure in the US is dysfunctional. So I'm not optimistic that that viable asset could be drawn down efficiently based on the rules we have today. So I would bet that no firm on this stage is saying, gee, I want to be in the reverse mortgage business. That's going to be good for Prudential or State Street's brand. We're not going there, but I think that would be an area of policy that would be ripe for good opportunity. And then in terms of our target date funds, good for the latter part, that complicated drawdown, but not too fast, not too slow. But Dave was saying, no, target date funds, their current construct, weren't built for that. And we need to have innovation and an alignment as an industry. All right, how can we help people have the right mix of longevity protection, a slice of that? Maybe it's something like a QLAC, the deeply deferred annuities, plus a appropriately tailored, institutionally priced mix of bonds, some sort of liability-driven investing with equity exposure. And I think that's the next chapter that we need to get working on innovating.
I think it would be a shame if an industry that had gotten people used to target date investing, and actually I'll take issue with you, they are designed to go from accumulation to decumulation, and people are, after 30 years of investing in them, used to it. 80% of all new money goes into that. I think what we need to do, and I think everybody's in agreement, there probably needs to be some sort of guaranteed income piece of that, but it can be embedded in the target date and start when you retire. So I'm not sure we should throw out.
What you described, Ann, I would agree with you.
Right, we shouldn't be throwing the target date out.
But if you have an overlay built into it,
we probably all agree we need.
I mean, I think we all have different flavors of what we think the best answer is. But and I will argue loudly with people on the minute differences between ours. But like in principle, I think we all would agree that.
Cocktail hour.
Right. But I would say, one thing that I think, broadly speaking, people conflate is a long time horizon with the need to have a lot of risk. And the reason I think that can be dangerous, not always, is the mathematics of systematically pulling money out of your account and selling work really differently than the mathematics of systematically contributing. And so the risk level, I think we're all so used to thinking 30-year time horizon, you should have at least 60 or 70% in equity. But that becomes very problematic when you actually have to sell. And one of the things that we do a lot of research on is the lumpiness of people's spending as they transition into retirement. And it is really lumpy, and people make very large lifestyle choices. One of my colleagues describes it as trying on retirement, and you move here, you move here, there, you decide you hate playing golf, you actually go back to work because you're bored. Like there's a lot of stuff that happens that seems to be very expensive or lumpy. And so one of the things I think we really think about is trying to help individuals understand how to align the appropriate level of liquidity and guarantee and the appropriate level of growth potential, while knowing that at any point in time they're likely to make an irrational decision and need a big bunch of money. So it's complicated.
And you might have a negative surprise early in your retirement, either in markets or in your life.
Right, which really derails things. Yeah. So I think it's an interesting problem to work on, but it's very complicated.
Mic possession is 9/10 of the law. So
Got it. Hi, I'm Deb Whitman with AARP. So this is a fairly historic panel for me to see, where the entire panel agrees that we really need to do something massive on coverage, and particularly an industry panel. Several years ago, I wouldn't have seen that. There would be a lot more hedging. So my simple question is, what's changed? How has the industry really come along to really see the need for universal 401k or other type of
Maybe
broad
the work
coverage?
you've done, 72 million American retirees are going to be living in poverty by 2030.
Thank you.
That needs to be a very scary, I think, thing for all of us as Americans, and should force us into action.
I think
before it gets to be too bad.
This is the fourth time we're doing this too.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of us have been here,
Good
many
job,
new
Aspen.
people, but yeah, I mean, this is the fourth
Good
time we're
job,
doing
AARP.
Yeah, so this is a day one. Imagine what we're going to do by Friday. So, thank you.
You asked a question at the beginning with your kids, and the one thing we haven't talked about is the level, and I hate the word, so forgive me, literacy, financial literacy in the U.S. We haven't talked about that. That has to be a part of it, whatever we're going to do. And there's so much technology in this world, and you have so much on your phone. It just can't be that hard for us to get people to make better decisions in the right moments. They need to make decisions around financial issues. So, and I know everybody's working on it.
No one who is right up against this can say with a straight face, nobody told me. When I was in my 30s, when I was in my 40s, no one can really say with a straight face, nobody told me I ought to be saving for retirement. The big voices in the culture, I went to work in 1976 for an actual hourly wage and paid FICA taxes and all that. And I can honestly say, for all that time, the big voices in the culture have been warning, and the drum beats have been there, if you've chosen to listen, that you have to be ready. You can't do it all on Social Security. So just saying so doesn't work.
No, I think we need to help.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to say, this is a whole separate chapter to this discussion, right, in terms of engagement. But think about how conventional wisdom has changed. I mean, go back to the late 90s, the public service messages of, don't get into cars with strangers. Don't meet people on the internet. What did I do when I got up this morning? I pulled up my Uber app, right? I summoned a stranger from the internet, and I got into their car. So I
probably talked to him.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the way that we're going to interact with that end participant it's got to change, and it's going to change in massive ways that probably none of us can even imagine up here.
Any moderator has two duties. One is to run an interesting panel. The other one is to get off on time. Please thank our panelists.
Okay.
I'll just add my thanks, and I'm going to echo Deb. When we first conceived of this discussion, we thought, wow, it'd be great to kind of talk about stakeholder capitalism. It's hot. And then we had individual calls with each of our panelists, and I was floored by the degree of, well, we're going to talk about what a national solution could or should look like. I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, we'll do that. Let me just add a question, maybe add a question to make sure that we brought this out. So I just thank you to all of you. I'm excited about the conversation to come over the next few days about how do you take what seems to be broad support for a federal solution that leads to universal auto enrollment and talk about sort of what happens next in tactics. So thank you to our panel. Thank you to all of you. And that concludes our programming. We invite you to join us outside for a reception. Thank you so much.